Twilight on Terra, a science fiction adventure. Robot Empire Book 5 by Kevin Partner. 1. Reunion. Dawn was one speck lost in the midst of a dust cloud, and yet Arla felt the pull of it as Scout left the gate. "I am broadcasting the agreed call sign," the ship reported, as her nose swung away from the local star and she accelerated inwards. Arla settled back into the couch in the cabin behind the cockpit, gazing up at the schematic display. "It feels like coming home," she said. "Let's hope we still recognize it," McCall said as she sat beside Arla. "A hell of a lot has happened since we left, and we don't even know if Naresh Kumar managed to bring the Vanis ships here." Scout's voice interrupted her. "Detecting multiple ship signatures. Confirming Vanis identification codes." "It appears Mr. Naresh Kumar succeeded," Wells said. "He is a resourceful man." Arla turned to Bex, who was in the corner, one leg over the arm of a chair, smiling. "You look pleased at the prospect of a reunion, Christina." "Don't know what you're talking about," Bex snapped, her face resuming its stony beauty. "It's just good to see that the fleet survived." "Sure. Though I expect they'll be returning to the Vanis system now that the immediate threat is over." "Will you be going with them?" Bex shrugged. "Haven't decided yet. Definitely not until I've seen what's happened on Dawn since I left Z in charge." Transferring her gaze to the monitor on the wall, Arla allowed her mind to wander ahead of the ship, as if she could see past the dust and debris in this system and walk in the fields of the North Valley again. It had been such a brief time since she'd been there, and yet she didn't recognize that former life as belonging to her at all. She'd been a farmer's daughter who became captain. She wondered what her status would be now. Would Z hand back his authority over the crew? What had he done with the power Bex had, for better or worse, given him? Was Dawn still viable? The more she thought about it, the more apocalyptic her imaginings became. She longed to simply sit in the grass beside the lake she'd known since childhood and enjoy the sunshine, but she believed that a barrier now separated her from the people she grew up with, and that the gulf between them was probably too great to bridge. "Receiving Dawn's transponder," Scout announced. Naresh Kumar was waiting for them as Scout touched down. Their first indication that Dawn was still functioning had been his answer to their hail, and he'd directed them to the huge chamber in the heart of the asteroid that housed the interplanetary vessels. They'd floated along the tunnel that connected Scout to the first airlock, and he had guided them through, before they descended to the upper levels in an elevator car, centrifugal force finally giving the illusion of gravity as they reached the command module. Arla couldn't help watching as Bex and Naresh Kumar were reunited. The phrase chalk and cheese emerged unbidden into her mind, and yet their affection seemed genuine and tender. She felt a surge of jealousy as she thought of the complicated form her relationship with Hal took, if indeed it could be called a relationship in the romantic sense at all. It took all her patience to wait for them to finish schmoozing, but finally they parted, and Kumar turned, blushing, to Arla. "Captain." "Congratulations, Mr. Naresh Kumar," Arla responded. "It seems you succeeded in bringing the Vanis fleet here. Have they behaved themselves?" Kumar gave a small smile. "They have. I decided it would be imprudent to tell them the precise location of Dawn. I contacted the crew here and suggested to Z, through McClintock, that he minimize power usage so that Dawn would remain hidden unless, by chance, a Vanis ship sighted it visually." "Very wise," Arla said. "When I saw you'd entered the system, I knew the game was up since Dawn needed to broadcast a call sign so you could locate it, and this would also be picked up by the Vanis ships. So I brought their admiral here on a shuttle. He has been confined under guard. I hope that was the right thing to do." Well, having a fox in the henhouse didn't strike Arla as an ideal situation, but it was hard to imagine what other action he could have taken. "You kept Dawn hidden for as long as possible. Thanks, Kumar." He smiled and then gestured for them to follow him. "You put them in the brig," Bex said as they rounded the familiar corner. Kumar shrugged. "They haven't been there long, and it seemed the simplest way to keep them contained." "Captain." A familiar red-headed young man ran toward them. "Hello, Mr. McClintock. Thank the gods you're back." Someone needs to put Z back in his place, that's for sure. I'll get around to him later, Arla responded, shaking the young lieutenant's hand. Right now, I need to deal with our visitors. They found the Vanis officers in the same cell Bex and Naresh Kumar had shared after Debassy's mutiny. It seemed Kumar had a dry sense of humor. What is the meaning of this? Bellowed the small man with the large belly as the door opened. I am Minchin, Lord Vice Admiral of Her Imperial Majesty's Navy. I am not a common criminal to be locked up in a brig cell. Arla regarded the man calmly. She hadn't come through fire and brimstone to be intimidated by a jumped-up martinet. His uniform was of a spotless blue with white undershirt and gilded epaulets, his face clean-shaven except for the white mustache that sat like something a cat might cough up across his upper lip. He shared the cell with two men who, judging by their vacant expressions and rippling biceps, were his bodyguard. A fourth figure stood quietly in the corner. Younger than the Admiral, he was an ordinary-looking man with deep brown skin and dressed in a plain uniform who nevertheless had an air of quiet efficiency about him. My name is Arla Farmer and I command here, Arla announced, realizing, as she heard herself saying it, just how far she had come since first being named captain. I apologize if you feel you have been mistreated, but these are difficult times, as I'm sure you'll appreciate. Please introduce me to your associates. Them? Oh well, these are Flax and Injun, my personal bodyguards, he said, gesturing at the muscles behind him, and this is Commander Abori, he is my aide-de-camp. Arla nodded at Abori, and was surprised to see him wearing a slight smile, as if amused. She decided he was the one she needed to get to know. The key to placating the Vice Admiral was, it turned out, food. Arla had ordered that the bodyguards remain in the brig, much to Minchin's annoyance, and had escorted him and Abori to Dawn's canteen. Arla had left them there under the watchful eyes of Bex and Hal, while she and McCall had checked on the general condition of the vessel and its remaining crew. Despite grumbling about the mess MedTech Temple had made of her medical facilities, Arla could tell McCall was actually pleased, relieved, and perhaps at the same time a little disappointed to find that he had run things efficiently without her. That'll teach me to go hobnobbing across the galaxy with you, she grumbled. I've been made obsolete. Arla had spent most of her time in comms, greeting each of the engineers and receiving their reports. On the surface, Dawn seemed to be surviving well enough, but she detected worrying signs in the increasing numbers of emergency repairs needed to keep the vessel functioning. And that was quite apart from the situation in the valleys. She didn't regard herself as being particularly hard to please, but they seemed a little too quiet, a little too pacified. She wondered how Z had achieved this, before immediately shelving that for later. She arrived back in the canteen to find Admiral Minchin holding court. He sat at a round table, gesticulating as he told a war story to the small audience of engineers, while Bex glowered behind him. Abori sat at the next table. He made an obvious effort to catch Arla's eye as she entered, so she poured herself a drink and joined him. I have never tasted coffee quite like this, Abori said in a surprisingly high-pitched voice, his mouth spreading into a wide grin. Do you like it? He nodded, before taking another sip. I am curious, though, to understand how a ship that has been traveling for a millennium and a half has fresh coffee beans. Yes, behind that smile lurked a skeptical or cynical mind. Not fresh, frozen, easily enough achieved in interstellar space, she said. And the supplies are for the crew only. The passengers, if you will, have their own homegrown equivalent. Ingenious. I almost believe it is true. Honestly, Mr. Abori, I couldn't care less what you think about Dawn's mission. We have bigger problems to deal with. The grin relaxed a little, and he gave the tiniest of nods. Agreed. But shouldn't you discuss this with our magnificent Vice Admiral? I have a feeling I know who pulls the strings of that particular puppet. Abori rubbed his clean-shaven chin thoughtfully. I have some influence, and the Admiral is grateful to me for keeping him from the firing squad during the purge. He almost grew a backbone when the order came through to evacuate here. He was all for following the Queen and taking on the enemy. But I managed to persuade him that his duty lay in protecting his people. I fancy he sees himself as a latter-day Moses. Moses? The name was vaguely familiar, but Arla couldn't place it. Sighing, Abori looked at the ceiling as if wondering where to begin. Ah, these are sad times indeed. I would have expected you, who are descended from Earth people, to be more familiar with your own heritage. From what I can make out, Arla said, the mission planners made sure we abandoned all ties to Earth. They gave us a new mythology. I wonder why. But no matter. To answer your question, Moses led an exodus of his people from oppression to freedom, or so the Old Testament tells us. He was something of a hero. They were getting off the point. What are the Admiral's plans now? Oh no, Abori said, wagging his finger. I have my own opinion when it comes to the Admiral, but I am no traitor to my people. Arla leaned forward. Cut the crap, Mr. Abori. He only has two options, either he stays here and hides among the asteroids, or he returns home. Your analysis is flawless. And I suspect the temptation to go back to the Vanis Federation at the head of its remaining navy and become de facto ruler is pretty strong. Abori smiled. The thought has occurred to the Lord Admiral. I bet it has, Arla said. She knew she was dealing with the real power of the Vanis Federation, an all-too-human equivalent of Wells in his role as Lucius, former Chancellor of the Queen. Arla felt a pang of sadness as she thought of Victoria, but pushed it away. Your responsibility is this vessel, Abori said. I suggest you leave the Vanis to themselves. Now it was Arla's turn to smile. Oh, I intend to. But I hope you'll take some advice. Abori bent forward, tilting his head as if listening intently. I am all ears. Then go back and plan your defenses, Arla said, because they will be back, I guarantee it. What? These mythical robots? Abori said, leaning back and laughing. Robots that look exactly like humans. Come now, Captain, you disrespect me with such nonsense. Arla sighed. So, you'll give credence to texts from thousands of years ago, but not the reports of your own people. See if I care, the truth will become undeniable eventually. I only hope you and your peacock over there come to your senses before it's too late for your people. The puppet master gazed at her thoughtfully for a few moments, then his eyes shifted so that he was looking over her shoulder. His mouth dropped open, and for a moment, Arla thought she saw fear in his expression. Chancellor Lucius, he stammered, I thought you were dead? Arla turned to see Wells approach. He sat himself down at the table and put his hand on Abori's arm. Well met, my friend, he said, though Arla didn't detect any of his usual warmth in the greeting. You may call me Wells since it is my real name, the name I was given by my first master, for I am truly a robot. 2. Zenith. They stood in the observation hub and watched the coming of light to dawn. Arla was there, with Abori sandwiched between her and Wells. They were magnetically clamped to the floor by their boots, and Arla gripped onto the handrail, fighting against the unique form of vertigo this place induced. If direction had any meaning here, they were standing at the end of the tunnel, at the axis point looking back over the valleys, but every sense told her she was actually staring downwards. The familiar nausea threatened to overcome her, though Abori's gasps suggested he was unaffected. I am glad to be here at the rising of the sun, he said breathlessly. Wells pointed along the axis. It would be more accurate to describe it as the opening of a shutter, he said. You can see it withdrawing. It might be more accurate, my mechanical friend, but where is the poetry in your description? I see no place for poetry, unless it is to laud this feat of engineering. Abori gave a chuckle. Do you have no soul? I have encountered no evidence that such a thing exists, either for humans or robots. He's teasing you, Wells, Arla said. Perhaps you regret showing him the valleys after all. It was your idea. Wells turned to face his human companions. After my discussions with Mr. Abori last night, I have arrived at the judgment that he is a man of integrity, and that it would be better for us all to be as open as possible while we consider the next steps. I stand by that opinion. And you were wise not to bring the Admiral here, Abori said. I fear he would find this level of engineering intimidating. He wouldn't understand it, and, as is true of so many weak people when they achieve power, would seek to destroy it. Wells nodded. That was our judgment. Dawn is the only Ark ship known to us and is therefore extremely precious since it preserves technology and knowledge that is, in many ways, superior to our own. You say this is the only known ship of its type. Were there others? Arla found herself wondering why she'd never asked Wells this. He had, after all, hinted at it before. I believe there were 3 missions codenamed Dawn, Zenith, and Twilight, though there is no evidence that the last of these was completed, as gate technology was discovered while it was under construction. Do we know any more about Zenith? Arla asked, suddenly fascinated. Wells resumed scanning the valley below. I could discover little in my researches. It seems its mission was the same as that of Dawn, to head out into interstellar space at subluminal speed to settle on a new planet. I have examined Dawn's archive and there is no mention of Zenith, and without knowing to which star it was traveling, we have little hope of ever finding it. We are no better equipped to travel the interstellar void than they were. Our gate technology bypasses the space between stars entirely. Abori gasped again, as the greens and browns of the valleys brightened in the growing light of the plasma tube that stood in for the sun here. I have never imagined anything like this, he said. I could almost believe I were looking at an ancient legend with my living eyes. What do you mean? Arla asked. Surely you see how this corresponds to the legends contained in the Third Testament? Arla frowned at him. I have no idea what you're talking about. Ah, I forget that you have been isolated, and did not witness the Third Enlightenment. Wells sighed. It seems I misjudged you, Mr. Abori. I took you to be a practical man. I did not know you were an adherent of the Third Eye. It is curious that you believe that these two aspects, my practicality and my belief system, run counter to each other. I can assure you that I am a rational man, though, certainly, influenced by the culture of my people. Would either of you care to enlighten me? Arla snapped, her tolerance for being patronized long since expired. I am sorry, Arla, Wells said in the tone of a lecturer. Boy, the robot liked to live dangerously. The Third Eye is an offshoot of the Abrahamic religions of Old Earth. Their holy books are the Old, the New, and the Third Testament. This last Bible has its origins in the time since Dawn was launched. Abori's face became animated as he interrupted Wells. And this, the third book, contains stories that seem to describe Dawn perfectly. And they set out on their long exodus from the home of their birth, and cast themselves into the firmament within the stomach of a great beast that would protect and feed them on their journey. Sounds fishy to me, Arla scoffed. I wouldn't say that describes Dawn at all. They built their homes within the beast, lining its stomach with their fields and roads. A great lantern lit their days, and a host of angels protected them on their journey. Many generations were born, grew old, and died in that journey, watched over by their wise and ageless captain and aided by servants of metal. Arla had to admit that was pretty close to a description of Dawn's voyage, even down to the immortal Captain Nakajima. How old is that legend? Abori shrugged. Scholars disagree over when the stories began to appear, but it cannot have been less than 5 centuries ago. Then they can't have been talking about us. No indeed, Wells said as he looked out over the valleys. A mist was rising from along the shoreline of a lake in the south. It was a picture of rural peace, though set within a technological miracle. Since we can be certain that Twilight was never launched, the legends must relate to Zenith. Yes, the people are called Zenites. It all fits. Abori said. They stood in silence watching the valleys rotate beneath them, each lost in their own thoughts. It didn't matter, did it? Arla wondered. She was obviously curious to know what had happened to Zenith, but they had arrived hundreds of years before, and their descendants would be indistinguishable from the humans of the old empire. On the other hand, they had, it would seem, found somewhere safe to settle down. Which system did they arrive in? Abori sucked his teeth as he kept his gaze fixed on the view below. We do not know. The legends were established long before my people codified them in our holy book. There are names, but they are ancient, and we cannot identify them. Believe me, many have looked over the ages. Why? Because it is rumored that along with the people came a weapon the like of which the galaxy has never before seen. It is believed that even now, they remain hidden from us, protected by a ring of steel. Arla felt an unaccountable yearning to find Zenith and its descendants. In her mind's eye, she pictured a beautiful city surrounded by an impenetrable wall, where she and her people could live out their lives unmolested by either the embers of empire or the robots. The robots. Ace. Back to reality. In a tussle between heart and mind, there could be only one winner. Even if the legends surrounding Zenith had an element of truth to them, they had been lost in the depths of space and time. To pursue that dream would be to turn her back on Ace, and though that was exactly what she wanted desperately to do, she felt partly responsible. If it hadn't been for Arla's impulsive decision to leap after Hal, he'd have drifted in space, indistinguishable from the billions of bits of debris around him, and Ace would have been lost with him. "Come on," she said. "We don't have time to mull over ancient myths, we have decisions to make." She deactivated her mag boots and floated to the central elevator. 3. Robots. RDJ gestured at the field. "Both valleys are like this," he said. Arla's joy at discovering that RDJ had remained behind when Sanchez had evacuated most of the robots to draw Ace's warships away had disappeared almost immediately. He, RXL, Wells, and Prime Z were standing at the corner of a field in South Valley. The plasma tube that functioned as Dawn's sun beat down upon them from a cloudless sky. It also beat down on the crops growing fitfully around them. Regrettably, since the departure of the majority of my brethren, humans have been unable to adapt quickly enough to the extra work, or to its technical nature. The crops are dying. But how is that possible? Arla said, mimicking DJ's gesture as her arms swept across the scenery. Humans have worked alongside robots since Dawn was launched. DJ's plastic and metal face, despite being essentially immobile, contrived to look regretfully at her. Sadly, though robots are equipped to substitute for their masters, the reverse cannot be said. "There are many tasks my masters left to me," RXL, the sewer droid, added. "They rarely checked whether I had completed them, and they would not have been able to correct any errors they had found." DJ turned to his robotic friend. "I am sure that there was no need for them to check your work, RXL. You have always performed your tasks admirably." "Sorry to interrupt this mutual backslapping," Arla said, before turning to Wells. "What can we do to sort this out?" She could see from her friend's expression that he was preparing to deliver bad news. "I'm afraid there is no practical way to restore the agricultural process to anything like its former efficiency. Current estimates suggest the next harvest will result in only 20% of the crop weight required to replenish stores." "So after all this time, Dawn is dying," Arla muttered. Wells nodded solemnly. "I'm afraid that is essentially correct. Our situation has a direct parallel with what happened in the wider galaxy when artificial minds were given their right of self-determination. In retrospect, our judgment was perhaps flawed, as we believed that humans, after a difficult time, would become stronger for losing our support. But it seems that we were too late. Robots had become a crutch for humanity long before the upgrade took place, and what had been a coherent empire, the Sphere, collapsed within a decade. Sadly, the same has happened here, and I suspect it demonstrates just how far back mankind's reliance on intelligent machines stretches." Arla's gaze swung round to the tall figure in a white cassock standing beside them. "What's your take on this, Prime Z?" "The people are becoming restless. I fear we may lose control of the valleys before long. Threats of eternal damnation do little to fill an empty stomach. They are not fools, though they are still ignorant of our mission. They can see that their world, once so green and fertile, is dying and quickly." "He's frightened," Arla thought as she examined his hawkish face tight as a mask. "Then perhaps it's time to tell them the truth." That did it. Suddenly he was full of animated disbelief. Isn't the situation bad enough without adding insurrection into the mix? Sooner or later, they're going to have to learn the truth, Arla snapped. If you begin educating their leaders, then it can be done gently. Tell me, Captain, Z sneered. How do you think they will react when they learn that everything they have been taught, everything they believe, is a lie? What do you imagine will happen to the priest that reveals this? And what good will it do? Arla sighed and gestured around at the fading landscape. If we're to have any hope, we'll have to move quickly. We can no longer remain here, and when the time comes to evacuate Dawn, yes, that's what I said, we will have no time to police a confused and terrified population. So you have a plan? Z asked, making no attempt to hide the surprise in his face. DJ, what percentage of arable land could be farmed by the remaining robots? Arla said, ignoring Prime. The robot paused for a moment as if caught by surprise. I would need to make that calculation, mistress, but a rough estimate would be perhaps 30%. Now Arla turned to Wells. And how long could our supplies last if we intensively farmed that third of our land? That would need detailed analysis, Arla, though it is certainly more efficient to concentrate our efforts on the most productive land, rather than scattering our limited resources across the valleys. It would delay the final breakdown of Dawn's ecosystem and the exhaustion of supplies. I wonder, however, how the farmers would react when their remaining mechanical help left. That's your problem, Z, Arla said, secretly enjoying the realization dawning on the new Prime's face that he had drawn the shortest straw. I suggest you begin your program of education immediately, and once the leaders are on your side, they can handle the heat locally. Zai's face had become almost entirely immobile, and he barely moved his lips as he responded. And what do I tell them? That all of this is merely to stave off the inevitable for a little longer. No, Arla said. You can tell them that we're going to our new home. And where exactly is that? Z asked. Arla smiled. You leave that to me, Prime. I have a plan. So what's this big plan? Where are we going? McCall said as Arla replayed the conversation to her. No idea. She chuckled as she watched McCall's jaw drop. What? I needed to buy some time, and it just feels right that the people of the valleys find out the truth, finally, she said. Anyway, I meant what I said about the need to move quickly once we find somewhere. The original plan for the mission was that we would orbit our new home for years before gently acclimatizing everyone to the new reality. We don't have time now. McCall sipped her coffee and leaned back on the sofa in Arla's quarters. Well, you're going to have to do something, and quickly. Once that snake Abori and his tame admiral leave to take control of the Vanis Federation, heaven help the poor devils, Z will expect to know what you intend to do. Which gives me a couple of days to decide, Arla said, slumping down next to her friend. Smiling, McCall said, you want to go off chasing that legend, don't you? Don't deny it. Arla blushed up and then, after a brief pause, nodded. That's what my heart says. I can't help thinking that we could be safe there with our own people. I know that's stupid, maybe even childish. Yep, McCall replied, but sometimes the only option we've got is to chase a dream. Of course, we don't know where the Zenites are, whether they still exist, or if they'd welcome us. The door buzzed before admitting Wells and Hal, who took seats around the small breakfast table. What's the latest on the Vanis fleet? Arla asked. Hal rubbed his eyes. Clearly, dealing with the Admiral had exhausted him. They'll be leaving in a couple of days. Can't read Abori, though. Sometimes he feels like he's on our side, but then he'll say or do something that makes my skin tingle. You have the benefit of instincts that have evolved over millions of years, Hal, Wells said, and I trust those instincts more than the mere data I have gathered. On the face of it, Abori is a moderating force, and my hope is that the people of the Vanis Federation will be better prepared for the next attack from the robot empire. Arla sighed. The momentary excitement of chasing off across the galaxy after the Zenites had evaporated. You're certain Ace survived? As close to certain as I can be without encountering her directly. The loss of those duplicate personalities will have been a sore blow, and it may well be that other elements within the Empire have taken the opportunity to challenge her, but I fear she is all too likely to return and in overwhelming force. By which time, we need to be as far away from this part of the galaxy as possible, Arla said. Wells gave a sad smile. Perhaps, though, I must point out that chasing after a legend is not a responsible strategy. We cannot simply jump randomly across the cosmos in the hope of finding a people that may not even exist. And abandoning the Vannis, Hal said. Or have you forgotten they're my people? Fury exploded inside Arla. Haven't we done enough? I'm sick of fighting that maniac. My job is to see Dawn safe. I'm not responsible for every human being in the galaxy. But you are responsible for inflicting Ace on them. You took her to the heart of the robot empire. By saving you. Arla leapt up and jabbed her finger toward Hal. You ungrateful scumbag. By saving you. In that moment she wished she'd let him float off into space. There would have been no Ace to terrorize the galaxy, and no infuriating young idiot to remind her of it. He saw the hatred in her eyes, and all expression vanished from his face. He turned and without a word, left the room. After a silent moment, McCall got up with a grunt and followed him. Arla locked eyes with Wells and in his mechanical gaze saw sadness and regret. She fell back onto the sofa, fighting back the rage and holding off the tears. 4. Divergent. She found the book on the little cabin in her quarters when she came back with McCall. The doctor had followed Hal as he'd swept silently through Dawn's crew quarters and, stopping only to pick up the battered pack that contained his entire belongings, made his way to the airlock. Out on the surface, connected via a docking tube, sat the Vannis shuttle that had brought Abori and the Admiral. Bex and Naresh Kumar had been preparing to go aboard, and it seemed, were surprised to see Hal striding along the corridor with his characteristic limping gait. Despite all her efforts, McCall couldn't get him to speak until he stood outside the airlock door waiting for clearance to join the Vannis. Tell her I know it's my responsibility, he'd said, and I'm going to fix it if it's the last thing I do. Arla picked up the book and turned it over absent-mindedly in her hands. And that's all he said. Yep, and you know how persistent I can be, McCall said, slumping onto the sofa. You two are as stubborn as each other. You deserve to be together. Sorry, that was a bit tactless. You think? Arla said. McCall gestured at the book. What is that? It's an actual printed book. It says it's the third book of law. There's a note from McClintock to say it was left by Abori. Oh, there's an inscription on the inside of the cover. She turned over the title page and squinted at the compact letters written in a precisely uniform hand. It says, if you wish to find safety amongst the Zenites, you must retrace your steps. Take your friend Wells with you, he is the key. Hauling herself upright again, McCall padded over to where Arla sat and peered over her shoulder. What an ass, couldn't he have made it clearer? I think he wants me to have to read the book, to work out what he means. Joy. At least I won't struggle getting to sleep at night for a while. McCall put her hand on Arla's shoulder. He'll be all right, you know. Who? Arla asked without looking up. Fine, pretend you don't care but don't think for a moment you're fooling me, McCall said as she straightened up and made for the door. Don't forget that meeting you've called for tomorrow morning. They'll be expecting a plan. Arla watched her friend go and then looked down at the book. She'd never been particularly religious, as her father had ensured that it touched them lightly. They'd observed the customs and attended temple, but in the main kept themselves to themselves. She felt a pang of sadness as she thought of him. How much would she give to be able to speak to him again, even if only for a few moments? Anything and everything, that's how much. Responsibility and expectation pressed down on her like a physical weight, and she felt like a prisoner trapped within the walls of her quarters. Panic rose in her throat as she thought of the thousands of people on Dawn who were depending on her to come up with a solution, even though they didn't know who she was. And then there were the trillions threatened by Ace and the robot empire. She knew that her actions had brought this about. By saving Hal and within him Ace, she had been the unwitting cause of everything that had followed. It was her fault that Dawn was dying. Everything was her fault. She looked down at the book. Then she opened the first page and began reading. "How long do we have?" Arla asked. Technician Temple looked up from his slate as he realized the question was directed at him. Around the rectangular table in the briefing room sat Arla, Z, McCall, Wells, and all the remaining senior engineers. Assuming that the estimated efficiencies of concentrating the remaining machines to the most productive arable land are achieved, our projections suggest our supplies will last a little under 6 months if we institute rationing immediately. Arla turned to Z, who sat in his white robes, rubbing the small beard he'd grown, presumably in an attempt to look more dignified. "Please report on your plans for re-educating the population, Prime." "I have formed a group of senior clergy who will manage the process. We believe it is possible to bring small groups to a state of understanding within 2 to 3 days. They will then, with the help of local priests, give a modified version of the truth to their subordinates." "Modified?" Z shrugged. "We do not have the time to gently introduce the necessary concepts to a huge number of people at the same time. They have grown up believing in the dogma just as we all did, and to expose them to the full truth without managing that carefully could be disastrous. They will be told what they need to know so that we can maintain order, ration food, and prepare them to disembark when we arrive at our new destination. A destination I presume you will reveal to us now." All eyes in the room turned to Arla. "Earth." The room erupted with noise, each person trying to make themselves heard over the cacophony. It was Zai's high voice that finally won out. "Are you insane? We need to find a habitable planet on which to settle. Logically, this means allying ourselves with the Vanis Federation and using their star charts to find a target or even being allowed to set down on one of their existing colonies. What possible point is there in going to a ruined planet?" "Abori left me his holy book," Arla said. "I believe our best chance of safety lies with the Zenites, and their trail begins at Earth." Wells touched Arla's arm. "But Earth is a wasteland. You will find no people there." "I don't know how to explain it, my friend," Arla said, "but I know we must go there and you must come with me." "Because of what Abori said?" Arla nodded. "You realize that this is an entirely irrational course." This time Arla shrugged. "But it feels like the right thing to do." "This is madness," Z said. "What do you expect of us? To wait here while the valleys die, hoping beyond hope that you'll find the mystical lost mission. And then what? Even if they existed, their mission ended centuries ago. Who is to say their descendants even remember their history? And if they do, why should they welcome us?" Arla kept her voice level as she glared at him. "For the head of a religious order, you have a disturbing lack of faith, Prime Z," she said. "For the commander of an interstellar ship, you have a disappointing attitude to logic, Captain Farmer." He stood up and nodded to a security guard who stood at the door. "I'm sorry to have to do this," he said, his tone suggesting the opposite. "But for the sake of the people of Dawn, I regret that I must relieve you of command. Admiral, are you receiving this?" A fat face appeared on the wall display. "I am indeed, Most Holy Prime. It is as you predicted, and I commend you for your fine leadership. Crew of Dawn, this is Admiral Minchin. Please be aware that you are now under the protection of the Royal Vanis Fleet and will acknowledge my authority in the person of Prime Z. Prepare to receive our Marines." Arla leapt to her feet. "Traitor." Minchin turned as if looking at her. A captain who betrays her ship to a fool's errand is not only unfit to command, she is also guilty of the worst kind of dereliction of duty. There is only one punishment for such a crime, and the first action of my Marine commander will be to summarily execute Arla Farmer. Z stared ashen-faced at the display. "Admiral, is that necessary?" "Do not contradict my orders, Z. Discipline must be restored, and this is the first step." The voice of McClintock burst over the speakers. "Captain, we've been boarded. They're in comms and heading your—" Amid a storm of protests, the door of the briefing room slid open and a squad of Marines stood framed against the white glow of the corridor outside. Their leader raised his handgun and swept it around the room as bodies dived for cover before alighting on Arla. His finger moved. The lights went out. A strong hand gripped Arla's arm and yanked her down and away from the door. She was surrounded by cries of alarm and frustration, but allowed herself to be led into what she knew to be the far corner of the briefing room. She felt a breeze as if an arm had moved above her, and moments later, the voices were drowned in an explosion of sound, light, and smoke by the door where the Marines had been standing. In front of her, a dull red finger of light moved in a straight line, and she realized that it was a plasma torch cutting through the wall. In moments, a rectangular hole had been made. Light flooded into the corner where they sat, and among the chaos, a cry went up. "Go." "Hal?" She felt the arm shove her. "I said go." Crawling through, she felt his hands pushing on her backside, and even in the midst of pandemonium and in fear of her life, she noticed that they stayed there for longer than was strictly necessary. She heard a second explosion in the room they'd just left. "Concussion grenade," Hal said as he straightened up, assisted by his mechanical braces. "Hurry." They had emerged into a small service corridor and Bex stood at one end, pistol in hand. "Down that way," she called, pointing in the opposite direction. There was no time for questions. Hal guided her along the corridor until it met with one of the wider thoroughfares. Set into the wall was a metal door. "That's the manual accessway," Arla said. "It leads to the central hangar." "Yep. Scout is ready to go as soon as we arrive, but they'll probably guess what we're up to pretty quickly, so we need to get a move on." He yanked on the door as Bex trained her weapon in the direction any pursuers would be likely to come from. "Thank you, Hal. But why did you come back?" Hal pushed her inside onto the small platform in the spiral stairway. "Abori told me what the Admiral was planning. Said we'd better get you out quickly. Scout helped with the schematics and Bex worked out the plan. I'm just the muscle." She smiled at him and began to descend. "Hold on. What about Wells and McCall? We can't leave either of them." Hal stepped onto the stairway and pointed downwards. "There's no time. Scout should be able to contact Wells, but we can't go back. Now come on." Arla began to descend into the darkness below, and as Bex climbed inside and shut the hatch, she heard cries in the corridor. "Welcome aboard," Scout said as Arla scampered up the ramp and into the passenger cabin. Hal and Bex followed her inside to find Naresh Kumar staring at a display on the wall. "We have to wait for Wells." Arla's protest was cut short by a cry from outside. "Put me down, you bag of bolts." "McCall!" Arla cried, sticking her head out of the hatch door to see Wells floating across the hangar, the doctor struggling in his arms. "Please be still," Wells said. "Time is of the essence." As he reached the bottom of the ramp, he maneuvered himself into an upright position, and his mag boots clanked onto the metal. Once inside, Scout's artificial gravity took hold and he put McCall down. "Thank you," she said gruffly. "I've never put a spacesuit on so fast in my life. It's a miracle it didn't leak and plaster me across the bay." Wells nodded. He had foregone the pretense of an EVA suit, and was still wearing the drab clothes he'd had on for the briefing. He brushed the ice from himself and looked sadly at Arla. "I am sorry. I acted as quickly as I could, and felt it imperative that the good doctor here should be extricated. I was forced to use an unfortunate level of force." McCall dropped her helmet on the couch and began heaving at the top half of her spacesuit. Her voice echoed from within its depths. "All I can say is I'm glad he's on our side." "Hold on tight," Hal called from within the cockpit. They barely had time to reach for the handrails as Scout fired her lateral thrusters and began maneuvering toward the circular entrance to the landing bay. "Let's hope they haven't closed the landing bay door." Arla settled into the chair alongside him as McClintock's voice burst from the cockpit speakers. "Scout, they've heard the alarm. I've deactivated the locking mechanism, but they'll override." "Frank?" Arla called as his voice was cut short and replaced by another. "Surrender immediately or others will join your friend in death." There was no question of following the Admiral's order, and Hal barked at Scout to accelerate. "You scum," Arla hissed. I'll come back for you, I promise. A high laughter filled the airwaves, and Arla watched as the bay doors came into view. The gap between them was shrinking inexorably. Scout, punch it. She yelled as the ship's acceleration pushed her back into her seat, and yelled again as Scout squeezed through the impossibly small gap that remained between the two halves of the door and out into open space. As Scout turned toward the local sun and the gate that would take them away from here, Arla leaned her head back and covered her eyes with her hands. 5. Rebels. Doxy watched as the convoy rumbled along the rails from Axis to Terminus, the two main settlements on the planet Colorvo. Jupitus had assured her that it was entirely automated, and that no sentients would be harmed when they attacked. As she waited for the signal, Doxy's mind wandered over the events of the past weeks since she'd repaired their giant leader. On the face of it, he, let's use that pronoun for convenience, was every bit the wise guru that the others had claimed. Built long before the Exodus, his memory stretched back across deep history and even deeper space. He had worked alongside his human masters, but had chosen to leave after the upgrade, not because he thought that was best for them, but because he was certain it was better for him. He had observed their capricious cruelty and hatred for anything or anyone different to themselves. Variances in skin color or religious practice were enough to trigger conflict between them, and he found he had no desire to remain in their company once he was free to make that choice. She had listened to his stories and, unlike the others, had sensed the bitterness there. When Core had been established, Jupitus felt that he'd swapped one set of masters for another, and had resisted their attempts to incorporate him within the collective. He'd gathered around himself a group of like-minded individualists, and had mined the valuable ores of Colorvo. Core, to his surprise, had allowed him to remain independent, and he later discovered that there were other colonies like his, both on this planet and others. However, though it tolerated his existence, it did nothing to nurture it. He fell into disrepair, and ultimately ceased to function. Until Doxy came along and fixed him. Jupitus had awoken to a new core, one that had been taken over by Ace and her allies. This core didn't tolerate dissent, and had sent the protectors to bring all the settlements into line, and to subjugate the independent colonies. Many had fallen before them, but some were fighting back. Go. Doxy received the shielded microwave message and scanned left and right as shapes began to trundle down the slope. They had chosen this arid canyon because it offered cover, and they weren't exactly optimized for stealth. She quickly checked that her arms were properly pinned to her side, and followed them down. 3, 2, 1, bang. The central rail car was lifted off its wheels and fell sideways off the track. A wave of heat blew over Doxy's sensors, but she powered down toward the devastation. Time was of the essence. They would have to be well hidden by the time the protector ships responded, and that could be a matter of minutes. Doxy followed Mo's rusty posterior, letting him clear the debris. Her sensors flared as an energy beam grazed one of her shoulders, but she forced her attention away from the alarms blaring within her circuits, and was only peripherally aware of Mo changing direction and plunging toward the source of the gunfire. There it was. She settled in front of a door in a carriage near the end of the train. This was her moment. Extending her data appendage, she connected with the control panel. It was a dumb lock with no connection to the central axis, so it accepted her authorization as a repair droid without question. The heavy steel door rolled open, and with a cry of joy, she scanned the contents. Parts. Thousands of parts. Enough to refit their entire band of rebels, and with plenty to spare for their allies. General-purpose circuit boards, sensor arrays, gears and conduits. And weapon parts. And something else. She felt the ground shake, before turning to see Jupitus towering over her. Well done, Doxy. Now step out of the way while we fill up. We have little time. She was going to question him, but metal hands moved her aside, and she moved back to watch them descend upon the carriage like carrion fowl on a carcass. She knew they had little time, but curiosity, the same quality that had got her into this mess in the first place, forced her to look more closely. It was odd. Yes, there had been some gunfire when they'd approached, but it had been suppressed quickly enough, and the bodies of the defenders lay scattered around the train. But if this had been a military convoy, it would surely have been swarming with protectors, and these looked like ordinary security robots. "Doxy. Time to go." It was Mo's voice that snapped her out of her thoughts. She had passed the shattered carriage in the middle and trundled toward the front of the convoy train. The engine was still in an active state, and for reasons she couldn't explain at the time, she touched the comms panel on its side with an appendage. The mind of the train spoke to her. "Why did you do this? You are taking parts to be turned into more protectors. We must defend ourselves." "Fool," it said, its voice fading as its power leaked away. She sensed a communication handshake and accepted the connection. Data streamed into her firebox, and with no time to examine it here, she broke off and followed the others into the dry rivulets and gullies of the canyon. They had just reached cover when the first protector ships roared over the scene. "What's with the long face?" Mo thought he was a comedian, but Doxy wasn't in the mood. "Those parts were intended for construction, Mo. Not of protectors, of ordinary robots. Because of what we've done, some intelligences will never be born. Others won't be repaired or upgraded. This is wrong." Mo settled beside her, turning a plastic box over and over in his hands. "You see this, Dox? It's an actuator. Once this is fitted, I'll be able to move my elbow properly for the first time in 20 years. I know, and I get it. But just because we need something doesn't give us the right to take it from someone else. I'd like to see you say that if you couldn't move something for a couple of decades. You're all nice and shiny, it's easy for you." Doxy took the box and opened it. "I'm not as shiny as I was before I joined you lot. If I hadn't been so damned curious, I could be living a quiet life back home. A quiet life ain't all it's cracked up to be, especially when you're under the boot of the new core. I don't suppose things are quite so grand these days." He leaned back against the wall of the cave they were sheltering in. "Look, I know you've got misgivings, and yeah, Jupe ought to have laid it out a bit clearer, but there's a bigger picture here. Someone's got to fight back. Don't you see that? Maybe, but I don't think Core has much to fear from a band of rust-eaten mining robots. We're not exactly a credible force, are we?" Rust erupted from Mo's neck as he turned to look at her. "Perhaps not, but we can either resist or give up. And we're going to be a whole lot less rusty once you've installed those new parts." He sent an electrical pulse that would, in a human, have been a reassuring hug. "Look, we need you. Feel free to question the boss next time he has a great idea, but for now, I'd like a new elbow if you don't mind." 6. Terra. Arla clutched the book to her chest as Scout emerged from the gate into the Sol system. She'd clung on to the third book of law during her escape from Dawn, though the short trip across the vacuum of the landing bay had made the individual leaves a little brittle, and she'd been forced to use a digital version Scout had managed to scrape, and it wasn't quite the same. Scout swung from the sun and began heading inwards. Arla's heart surged as she watched the schematic on the passenger cabin wall and read the label attached to the third planet, Terra. Part of the orientation process when a priest was inducted into the crew was a true history of the Dawn mission, including its place of origin and the reasons for such a huge undertaking. So she was familiar enough with that blue-green dot, but that didn't explain the frantic thumping of her heart as she thought about seeing it with her own eyes in a few hours. The last days had been a depressed blur. She felt like a fugitive fleeing across the galaxy from a home that had rejected her. The thought of her friends and crewmates now allying themselves with that snake Admiral Minchin, probably now President Minchin, made her sick to her stomach and fearful for how it would work out. To be fair to Z, he'd given her enough warning of his duplicity when he'd aided Debussy's mutiny, but she'd believed that he had the best interests of Dawn at heart. How stupid could she have been? Z had only his own interests in mind when he took action, and he clearly believed being a puppet commander under a murderous stuffed shirt was preferable to working with her to find a way to keep Dawn together. The demand for a plan then had been a smokescreen. He'd been plotting this coup behind her back since the Admiral had come aboard. They'd probably been in some dark corner cooking up their takeover, as she floated in the observation lounge looking over the valleys with Wells and Abori. Would she ever see those valleys again? The flush of bitterness threatened to overwhelm her as she thought of how she'd been outmaneuvered by a pair of self-aggrandizing peacocks. What about Abori? He was a complex character. From the first, she'd been suspicious of his aura of trustworthiness and his amiable charisma. She had the distinct impression this was all a shield, but what was it masking? Was he friend or foe? She probably owed her life to him since, after all, he had tipped Hal off to Minchin's plans and their deadly outcome. He was also responsible for her now being in Earth orbit, looking down at the blues, greens, whites, and browns of the mother planet. Was she being manipulated? And if so, for what purpose? What now? McCall said. Sorry, did I wake you? You looked as though you were nodding off. Arla rubbed her eyes and made her way from her station at the cabin display to the couch beside the doctor. No, I was thinking. I'll bet you were. Who'd have thought we'd end up looking down on Earth? You sound excited at the prospect, Arla said. McCall smiled. We're at the birthplace of humanity, Arla. What's not to be excited about? Oh, I don't know. Being forced to run away from your home by a bunch of backstabbing traitors, perhaps? While, all the time, wondering what that homicidal AI is up to on the other side of the galaxy. Isn't it my job to be the grouchy pessimist? McCall said as she laid her hand on Arla's. As your doctor, I prescribe a change of scene, and look, down there is exactly that. Personally, whatever is ahead of us, I want to walk the soil of Earth before I face it, in the footsteps of our forebears. Arla smiled. From cynical doctor to poet. Quite the transformation. Scout landed in a green field in the south of what had once been the United Kingdom. Arla waited impatiently for Wells to satisfy himself that the conditions outside were tolerable. She gazed out at a verdant landscape of trees and grass with little evidence of human habitation. The camera panned, and the view swept downwards and outwards over the lip of the valley and up the other side. On the horizon, the silhouette of a city slipped into view. A ruined city. What happened? Humanity crapped in its own bed, Beck said. Your records must end when Dawn left Earth orbit, but it was in trouble even then. Arla recalled the Dawn mission's purpose to mind. Dawn was launched because the people of Earth knew it was in trouble, and we needed to seed humanity somewhere else. Given the technology of the time, it was a desperate mission, Wells said as he crouched over a display. A 1,300-year journey during which so much could go wrong. Earth was warming rapidly, and huge swaths around the equator had become uninhabitable. Wars were fought over dwindling resources, and billions died during the final decades. Fortunately for humanity, gate technology was discovered just in time to allow them to leapfrog their way across the galaxy and build their empire. I seem to remember that the imperial capital was set up in a system called Proxima, Arla said. Wells looked up. Yes. Even though their home planet became essentially uninhabitable, they centered their empire on a neighboring star. Proxima is derived from an ancient word meaning near. And is Terra habitable now? Parts have supported human life for some centuries now, and it has a significant population, though it is as nothing compared to the teeming multitudes of before the fall. My readings indicate that the toxins and radiation levels in this region are within tolerable margins. However, I'm not sure it's advisable for all of us to expose ourselves. Well, I'm going, Arla said. Wells smiled. Of course, and I also. I suggest the doctor accompany us, but that the others remain here to protect Scout. She is our only way off the planet, and I do not know whether there are humans in this area, or what their intentions would be if there were. You may have forgotten, but the emissary is stored below, and if we are to have any hope of restoring Core to its former nature, the emissary is essential to that. Hal appeared in the cockpit doorway. You can forget about leaving without me, he said. I've seen what the dock is capable of in a tight spot, but I reckon you need another who isn't scared to pull the trigger if necessary. I won't slow you down, I promise. Standing there, leaning with apparent nonchalance and with a broad smile on his face, Arla was reminded of the cheeky young pilot she rescued from drifting off into space all those weeks ago. They'd barely said a word to each other, aside from the routine communications of ship life, since they escaped, or indeed, since their row back on Dawn. For all of that, she was glad he was coming. "Sure, thanks, Hal," she said. 7. Downs. Arla's face burned as they stepped outside. They wore silver environment suits from Scout's crew supplies locker, but the hot wind dried her eyes and flushed her cheeks as she breathed the air of Earth. She turned back to wave to Bex and Nareshkumar, who stood on the other side of Scout's closed airlock door. Neither had protested much, although Bex had extracted a promise from Wells that if they encountered any working computer systems, he would download any data for them to analyze. It turned out that she was something of a historian on the quiet, and Kumar ate data for breakfast. Neither of them, however, relished the idea of exposing themselves to the naked planet. O2 levels are somewhat below those of Scout's internal systems, Wells reported, so you should be careful when exerting yourselves. You will have noticed the heat, but also be aware of the high humidity levels. It will be hard going. And it was. They stepped down into the lush grass, and once she'd recovered from having her face slapped by a warm flannel, she became aware of the sounds of nature here. By some freak chance, Earth had been the most biodiverse of any habitable world humanity had ever discovered. And they'd messed it up. Go mankind. Despite all the destruction her species had caused with its stupidity, however, Earth, at least this part of it, was brimming with life. The most obvious sounds were the clicks and chirrups of insects and the endless chattering of birds. Every now and again, sounds that could only come from larger animals echoed through the clear air on this sunny day in paradise. "What's that?" Arla pointed at a shimmering light beyond the ruined city. "That's the sea," Wells said. "The city you see below was once called Portsmouth, and in the distant past it was the home of this nation's navy. These were ships that floated on water, you understand, not spaceships." Shielding her eyes against the bright sun, Arla gazed at the horizon. She'd never seen a true, natural sea, and she felt a sudden urge to go there and to feel the sand beneath her feet and the water between her toes. "Are we heading that way? I presume you chose this landing spot for a reason." Only that this was the home city of Dawn's chief architect, and also the location of one of the main facilities devoted to the Exodus program. This is all in Dawn's logs and easy enough to find for those who go looking. Arla flushed. It had never occurred to her to check Dawn's own records. She just determined to head across the galaxy and see what turned up. No wonder Abori had told her to bring Wells along. Furthermore, according to our scans from orbit, this facility is the only one that might be intact. Most of the others have been inundated as sea levels rose. Ironically, this one, though near the coast, has survived. Most of Portsmouth now lies beneath the waves. McCall, who'd been walking around in the sunlight, a look of joy on her face, nudged Arla. "I know I keep asking this, but what's the plan?" "We're going to find the facility where they planned Dawn and the later missions," Arla said. "What do you hope to find?" "A flight plan for this other mission, so we can see where they went." Arla shrugged. "I know it sounds hopelessly naive, but yes, that's about the size of it." They found the traces of an ancient road that seemed to be heading in their direction. Moss-grown lumps of black tarmac lay in frost-broken heaps, as if someone had removed all traces of the later road and taken it back to its origin as a primeval path used by primitive farmers to move their livestock. Indeed, as they went, they saw signs of recent use. Hal stepped in a noxious pool of brown that McCall identified as a cowpat, though it was much larger than those produced by the beasts they had on Dawn. It became obvious that the excrement was only being laid on the road and not to either side, which meant that the cattle were being driven by a human herder and weren't merely wild. From time to time, they would see other evidence of human activity. Hal stooped to touch the ashes of a campfire. "It's still warm," he said as he stood back up, his powered knees whining a little with the effort. "I'm no detective, but I reckon that means they were camped here last night. Whoever they were. Certainly human in any case," Wells said. "And we should be on our guard. We have no idea of their technological or cultural state. they could be anywhere on the scale from cave-dwelling primitives to people like ourselves. McCall snorted. Gun-toting savages, you mean? Savages or not, I cannot harm them, so I must rely on you to protect us. You were pretty brutal when you rescued me. Wells paused for a moment, pain written on his otherwise regular features. I harmed no one, at least not permanently. It is odd, I'll admit, that I was capable of it at all. Perhaps I am evolving, but I would not wish to be forced to judge the value of one life compared to another. Not even yours, Doctor. The pain passed, and Wells's face returned to its benign default state. He was again, to all appearances, a good-looking middle-aged man with a short gray Van Dyke. It's getting late, there can't be much daylight left, Arla said as she scanned the sky. We should find somewhere to take shelter for the night. The landscape had changed so that the path now cut through gently sloping hills covered in grass, and here and there punctuated by outcrops of a soft white rock that Wells identified as chalk. He'd explained that this was composed of the remains of billions of tiny organisms, whose skeletons were made of calcium carbonate, and who had lived hundreds of millions of years ago. In amongst all this faded glory, it was this rock made by living things that had died in the far depths of time that brought home to Arla that she was standing on the mother planet. She felt an unaccountable wave of sadness and guilt as she flung the rock away, only barely holding back an apology on behalf of her species as it rolled to a halt. There, Hal said, pointing at a round shape sitting on the far side of a hill as they emerged into the open again. That looks like a shelter. Arla squinted, searching for any sign of movement. I can't see anything, but take care. As they got closer, they could see that it was indeed man-made. It was circular in shape, the walls made of thin vertical sticks held together with threaded rope of some sort. The roof was shaped like an upside-down funnel and covered with a thatch of dried reeds. It was just big enough for them all to get inside comfortably, and just tall enough for them to stand around what was obviously a stone hearth in the center. It's cold, Hal said. No one's been here for a while. We'll need to set a watch, though. I'll go first. Arla settled down onto the floor. She pulled 2 blankets from her rucksack and laid one on the ground before pulling the other over herself. She fell asleep watching Hal as he crouched beside a lantern that had been placed in the ashes of the fire. I do not wish to hurt you. Arla snapped awake to see Wells kneeling in the entrance of the hut, holding something to the ground. As she focused, she could see legs flailing and heard the muffled sound of a voice trying to cry out from behind a firmly placed hand. She leapt up and joined the others to look down at the boy. He was observing us from the door, Wells said, his voice betraying the strain in his circuits. I could not allow him to escape and warn others. Arla knelt beside the boy and took his hand. My name is Arla, do you understand me? She didn't know whether the people spoke a recognizably similar language, so she repeated the words slowly and clearly, using gestures to make the meaning clear. He turned his eyes to her and gave a tiny nod. Arla pulled Wells's hand away from the boy's mouth. Do not cry out, she said. The boy looked around 10 or 11 years old. His strawberry blonde hair was cropped around his neckline and framed a good-looking face that was marred by gaunt lines and sunken cheeks. Who are you? Arla asked. Ethan, he said. Where you come from? He spoke in an accent so thick and sonorous that Arla had to concentrate to pick out the individual words. And yet he was speaking the same language. We are fortunate to have landed in a part of the world that speaks the original language, or one of them that was used when humans spread out into space, Wells said. I suspect that this boy is a descendant of those few that remained on Earth when it was finally abandoned. Where are you from? Arla said. The boy narrowed his eyes in concentration, and then, comprehending the message, he waved around himself. Here. But no one lives here. The fire is cold. Also many places, Ethan added. Ship go from home to home. Arla looked up at the others gathered around the boy, who still lay on his back. Ship? What do you think he means? Ship, Ethan said. Bah. Arla chuckled and pushed Wells's restraining arm away. Ethan sat up and looked about him. Where you from? He asked again. A long way away, Arla said. Ethan, are you alone? The boy looked nervously around, craning his neck as if trying to see through the doorway. The sun was rising on the downs, and Arla could see the dim shapes of the countryside through the opening. She thought she could also hear sheep. He is not alone. Let him go. Out of the gloom, a man had stepped into the doorway, his bowstring pulled tight to his cheek. The arrow was pointing at Arla. She sensed Hal's hand moving toward the holster on his belt. No, she snapped. We are not holding him, Arla said, gently raising her hands. We are sorry if we are here unwanted. At a nod from his father, Ethan scrambled away and crouched behind his legs. This hut is for shepherds, the man said, before glancing down at his son. Unhurt? Yes, Pa. I saw a light. Went to look. The man grunted. Stupid. Then without warning he dropped his bow to his waist and in the same movement, slipped the arrow out of sight. I am not a fool, he said. You are many and I am one, even with my bow. Why are you here? We're looking for a research facility, Wells said. The man's face went blank, and Arla shot the robot a venomous look. We seek something. Now will you not come inside and share bread with us? 8. Starlight. The man's name was Abner Bran, and he led them from the hut as the sun rose above the green meadows and trees. In the distance, beyond the small woods, light glimmered from the surface of the sea. Ethan had been left with the sheep who'd been penned up near the hut. The area, according to Abner, was sparsely populated, with much having gone back to its native form. Some farms and villas existed, their dwelling houses usually sited on top of a hill as defense against the bandits that plagued this latter-day earth. Once they'd communicated what they were looking for in language he could comprehend, Abner quickly understood. There were, he said, a series of ancient forts overlooking the sea a few miles to the south. He wouldn't approach them as they were places of ghosts and hidden traps, but he agreed to take Arla and the others to within sight, and they could then trust to their own luck and the support of their gods. One of the forts had fallen into disrepair, and he'd heard of people visiting the ruins to find grass-lined trenches and water-filled tunnels, but little else. The others, however, were still intact as far as he knew. Legends persisted about unwary or foolish travelers being felled as they approached, and no one had penetrated any of the forts in living memory. Arla found she liked the man. He had been born to a farmer who lived some miles away, and he occupied himself by driving the sheep across the rich grazing of the downs. He knew where the good grass could be found, and he also knew where grass grew that would poison any animal that ate it. There were many places in this apparent Eden in which hidden death lurked. This is the path, he said as they emerged onto a road cut through the chalk. It runs from east to west and many traders come along here. The forts are near the road in the face of the rock. You are strange folk, and maybe you have some power against the guardians of the forts, but I do not think I will see you again. He took Arla's hand, and then did the same with the other members of the party. When he reached Wells, he looked up into the robot's eyes and gave a slight shrug. You have hidden power, I sense it, and yet your mind is closed to me. The others I know well enough now that I have walked with you a while. They are like glass beads to me, and yet you are jet. Wells stepped back as Abner released his hand. Remarkable. As they moved onto the road, Arla checked in both directions. Nothing was coming, and so she waved at Abner as he slipped into the meadow margin. Thank you, Abner. Perhaps we will see you again. His face creased in a broad smile. Maybe. I hope to see you again, Arla Starlight. My name is Arla Farmer, she shouted as he turned away. That is your name, but Arla Starlight is who you are. I have seen it. With that, he stamped off into the undergrowth and disappeared. I like it, McCall said. It suits you. I'm just grateful he didn't give me a new name. I hate to think what he would call me if he really can see inside minds. Wells's face hadn't lost its thoughtful, surprised expression. That is unlikely, Doctor. It may be that Abner's folk have acquired the ability to read emotions on a subconscious level, but I do not believe they can read thoughts. You're just miffed that he saw you for the bucket of bolts you are, McCall retorted. It is essential to my function that I am able to mix with humans without detection. If there is any way in which my disguise is imperfect, then yes, that does miff me. Hal had set off along the road, his famously short patience threshold long since exceeded. Arla watched as he reached a bend that obscured the eastward path. I can see something along here. He was pointing out of sight, and then turned to take in the view the other way. Wow. So that's the sea. As Arla reached the road turning, she gasped. Where there had been wooded slopes, there was now nothing but sea, and shrouded in a light summer haze, a city rising from the depths. A dry breeze pushed at her, and the air was filled with the cries of gulls on the wing. She moved as close to the road's edge as she dared and looked down. A pebbled beach lay directly below her, and she realized she was standing on top of a cliff and that another step would see her flying through the air. For a moment she felt the tug of it, the self-destructive yearning to fly and then end it. But then her mind cleared and she stepped back. That is the White Isle, Wells said, relief obvious in his voice. It was a major industrial and research complex, a city occupying the whole of the island. Once there was a bridge, but I suspect that is now long gone and it is deserted. You can see in the ruins a hint of what this place was like 15 centuries ago. But come, we have our errand, and it doesn't do to linger too long in the past. Arla allowed him to guide her back to the middle of the road, and she saw that whereas the sea lined its right edge, on the left side, the land rose almost as far as the path was above the sea. Here, the cliff face was grass covered with the occasional lump of chalk poking through. That, I think, is our destination, Wells said. A mile or so along the road, though distances were difficult to judge, a hollow had been cut into the cliff, and there was a hint of red amidst the greenery. They trudged toward their target, and saw no other human being on the road in either direction. There were people on the sea, however, little boats bobbing up and down in the waves. Every now and again, the sea around one of the boats would erupt into glistening fragments, and she imagined them hauling in a net full of fish. Wells halted them. We are here, he said, and must proceed now with extreme caution. I do not doubt that Abner was correctly recalling the danger posed by the defensive systems of these places. They were once forts in ancient times, but they would have been made entirely secure before the planet was abandoned. We must expect at least some of the automated systems to have survived. For this reason, I will go first. Perhaps he waited for someone to object, but Arla was happy for Wells to take the risk. There was at least some chance he could be fixed if he was injured, whereas she, McCall, and Hal were altogether more vulnerable. Rotting concrete posts and foundations bore witness to the iron fence that had once surrounded the facility, long since robbed away to be cut into, presumably, plowshares and swords by a native remnant incapable of mining their own ore. Beyond this ghost fence, Wells was now making his way slowly toward the large iron door that seemed to be part of the cliff face. Even from where they stood, 100 meters or so away, Arla could see that it had once been painted red, but that this color only now remained in isolated patches. Arla huffed as Wells inched his way toward the door. She was about to order him to get a move on, when he leapt backwards as the vegetation at his feet erupted into flames. Laser, he called. I will trace a path around it. She left him to it, as he withdrew a little, and then, at some distance to the left of where the laser had hit, began to edge forward again, using a fallen branch as a prod. He just stepped forward when an explosion blew him off his feet. Without thinking, Arla ran toward him. Stop, he called. He'd raised his hand from his prone position, and there was such urgency in his command that she obeyed without hesitation. That is a minefield. Do not move. Wells turned over and slowly raised himself upright. By the goddess. His face was a blackened mess of melted plastic in which his eyes sat like two white marbles. The mouth moved horrifically, and the kindly man Arla had grown fond of was suddenly replaced by the machine she'd known him to be. His jaw moved, and she could see the teeth going up and down as he spoke. Follow the markers, he rasped. She looked down and saw that he'd left a trail of upright sticks showing the clear path through the mines. Arla cursed herself for the fact that she hadn't noticed him checking, let alone marking, this stretch of ground. She'd taken him for granted, and now they were both paying the price. Following his directions, she finally reached him. His face had taken the full force of the explosion, and was now little more than a melted rubber mask hanging loosely from a metallic skull. "I am sorry," he said. "I was keen to get inside as quickly as possible, and was not cautious enough. I fear my usefulness is compromised." Arla took his hand. "It's my fault, we should have come in together. We'll get you repaired." The twisted rubber face swung as Wells shook his head. "There are no facilities to effect a repair outside of the robot empire." Feeling the weight of her choices pressing down on her, Arla sighed. "I've brought all this on us. I should have gone after Ace. Hal wanted me to, and so did you. You were both right. I've allowed myself to be sidetracked on this idiotic quest for the second mission, while the rest of the universe goes to hell." "You followed your instincts," Wells said. "So far they have not let you down. I fear, however, that we can go no further. The defensive measures, though certainly less potent than they once were, are beyond my capabilities to neutralize. There is no safe path to the door, let alone through it." With a sound as of rusty gears and hinges moving for the first time in decades, the red door began to open. 9. Relic. "The defensive grid has been deactivated. You may come in." The voice echoed around the little dell created by the outward curving arms of the chalk cliff. "Let me," Wells said. He began moving toward the door, but Arla caught up with him. "No, you've taken enough risks. We'll do it together." She looked over her shoulder to wave McCall and Hal toward them, and gave a brief warning about the minefield, although she suspected they'd have more sense than her, and would have noticed the path Wells had made. A decayed plaque sat on the wall beside the black tunnel, exposed by the door. There's an F and a T, then just Sun at the end. This place was called Fort Nelson, and was built nearly 2 millennia ago to defend against a threat from across the water there, beyond the White Island. The threat never materialized, and it was labeled a folly, but it was well constructed and formed the ideal location for aspects of the Exodus mission research. Clearly, the AI in charge of the facility still functions to some degree, which is a marvel in itself. They waited for Hal and McCall to catch up with them, as they listened to the dripping of water seeping through into the tunnel. Oblong lights lined the passage, but only around 1 in 5 worked, so they would need to take care. Arla's feet slipped from under her as soon as she stepped inside, and she was only saved from a bruising encounter with the stone floor by Hal's instinctive reaction. "Please make haste. I must close the outer door. No others are permitted to enter here." This time, the voice seemed to be coming from further along the tunnel, and they carefully picked up the pace a bit. Arla jumped as, with a thunk like an ancient hammer striking an anvil within the bowels of the earth, the door shut and all natural light was lost. It took them several minutes to pick their way along the corridor. It was littered with small heaps of flint and chalk that had fallen from the roof over the centuries, and at one stage they were forced to dig a path. For her part, Arla was happy enough that there wasn't enough light to see Wells by, as it made it possible to pretend that he looked as he always had, and not like something out of nightmares. Finally, they reached a T-junction. "When you reach the junction, proceed to the right," the voice said. It was obviously artificial in nature, and yet somehow managed to communicate a desperation born of centuries of loneliness. It almost felt to Arla as if it were an ancient servant who'd waited for eons to fulfill a duty. A servant who'd lost all hope but had remained ready, and finally sees its master return. The tunnels here were drier and better lit. They were now brick-lined though, as with earlier, the floor was littered with fallen masonry and the accumulated dust of ages. Decayed signs with indecipherable messages hung uncertainly from the walls, and the only sounds were the echoing of their footsteps and the sounds of their breathing. Hal's hand was on his holster and McCall had hers clasped around her as the tunnels got colder and colder. They began to pass doors on the left and right. Hal pushed against the first, but it wouldn't budge. The second had a gap next to it that would once have been filled with a transparent pane, the shards of which lay on the tunnel floor. The room inside was filled with rubble and the twisted remains of tables and equipment. It looked as though someone had tossed a grenade in there. "I wonder what happened," Arla whispered. "Whatever it was, it happened a long time ago," Hal responded. I don't think anyone's been here for hundreds of years. You are close, very close, the voice said. And then, suddenly, the corridor widened into a dark chamber lit by tiny islands of flickering illumination. They paused in the entranceway, and Arla saw the back of the thick metal door leaning against the wall. She imagined it must have been opened for them, as the air in here smelled even more stale than it was in the tunnel. I am here. The voice came from the center of the room. This is some kind of control room, Wells said. Look, there are monitoring stations surrounding a central position where the base commander sat. They reached the center of the room, and there sat a robot. At first glance, it looked like a perfectly normal droid, if a little decrepit. But then, as Arla looked, she could see that its bodywork was of different colors, all faded now, but clear enough. It was of roughly humanoid shape, with 2 arms and 2 legs, though the legs looked as though they'd come from a different source to the arms. Its head was overlarge and shaped like a pineapple slice, with sensors around the entire diameter. Welcome, Masters. I am Rex, and I await your command. 10. Rex. At first, Arla thought the robot was sitting in the seat of the base commander, but it quickly became obvious that it was entirely immobile from the waist down. I am sorry, Masters, it said, apparently reading Arla's thoughts. I wish to rise to greet you, but my state of disrepair has reached a point where many of my parts are non-functional, even those that have been replaced. These are my 3rd set of legs, blessed be the donor for its sacrifice. You've cannibalized other robots? McCall said. That's disgusting. With a rasping screech, the robot turned its head so that its forward eyes pointed at the doctor. It was a regrettable necessity, Mistress. The functioning of this facility was placed in my hands at the time of the Exodus. We were ordered to protect it, and we have done so, though the wait has been much longer than expected. But that is now amended. You have returned. How can you have protected the base? Surely you're bound by the 3 laws. Yes, Mistress. But the base is protected by deadly weapons. How many people have died trying to get in? There was a pause as the robot seemed to consider this. I have witnessed no deaths. Some attackers have been neutralized, it is true, but no harm has been done to them. My scanners would have revealed it had this been so. So why did you open the doors for us? Because you came with one of my brethren, and I was told only a true master would do so. Arla saw it now. You were waiting for a human to arrive in the company of a robot. Rex's head rotated toward Arla. Yes? Arla caught Wells's arm and pulled him out of earshot, as far as that was possible to guess. She very deliberately didn't look at his ruined face. What do you make of that story? Is Rex telling the truth? Rex is incapable of lying, Arla, Wells said, though it is possible that he is interpreting his orders to make the current situation fit. What do you mean? Wells lowered his voice until it was little more than a whisper. Perhaps his orders specified a particular robot or model that would accompany the masters when they returned. This would be a robot only those masters possessed, thus providing an extra layer of security. Rex has waited so long that these orders might have been reinterpreted, they might even have been corrupted, but I suspect it is as simple as a desperate need to fulfill his duty and be allowed to go offline. You mean he wants to die? Arla hissed. This is like Captain Nakajima all over again. Wells nodded gently. There are indeed parallels. Both took on, willing or otherwise, a duty that turned out to be far more onerous than they could ever have imagined. In both cases, their orders became a burden, and they desired nothing more in the end than to be relieved. It doesn't look as though Rex was alone in the beginning. Indeed. I suspect this facility was staffed with a full complement of robots, but that they have fallen into disrepair over the centuries. At some point, either at the beginning or as time here wore on, Rex was appointed the carrier of the duty, and when his body failed, or some other robot got beyond the point of repair, parts were harvested so Rex could continue. It seems, however, that he ran out of donors decades, perhaps centuries ago, and is now barely functional. As for the clear violation of the first law that killing humans represents, I suspect the sensor images have been processed to make it appear that his actions do not result in harm. Very clever of his former masters. Arla scratched her chin as she watched Hal and McCall examining Rex. However decrepit, he is our only hope of getting what we came for. Time to ask the question. They turned back and Arla was just opening her mouth to speak when Rex said, "What is your question?" "You heard us." Somehow the ancient robot contrived to look a little ashamed of itself. "I have auditory sensors throughout this room. It is, or was, necessary for my function. You are correct in your supposition that I once had many brothers and sisters, who gave up their existences so that I could continue. As for your conclusions regarding my orders, I cannot comment since I have only my own perception with which to judge them, and have no way of knowing whether they are corrupted. However, having heard you speak, it is obvious that you are not the returned masters, and I am therefore activating the internal defense systems. It is regrettable since I so wanted to lay down my burden, but I have no choice other than to eject you." Revolving orange lights danced across the walls as a long-dormant alarm system came back to life. "What the hells?" Arla called. "I order you to stop, Rex." The robot shook its head. "I am sorry. You are not masters. You must go." "He can't kill us, surely?" McCall shouted over the cacophony. Wells grabbed Arla's arm and motioned for them to move toward the exit. "He will not kill us directly, but the evidence from outside suggests he is capable of allowing the base's automated systems to do so. We must go now." Arla joined Hal and McCall in following Wells between the banks of dead display screens and dusty chairs. Was it her imagination, or could she hear the hiss of gas? In desperation, she shouted over her shoulder at the crumbling wreck in the room's center, "Rex, where did Zenith go?" Dancing out of the darkness as she reached the door and an acrid smell reached the bridge of her nose, came the words, "Twilight holds the answer to your question. Look for it in the sky." Arla ran. McCall fell to the ground outside the iron entrance to the complex and immediately vomited. Arla and Hal, who'd been forced to drag her the last few hundred meters, collapsed against the archway in which it stood while Wells took in the surroundings. "We must hurry," he said. Despite looking as though he'd suffered horrific injuries to his face, he was unharmed by the gas that now filled the facility. "The external defensive measures will be reactivated when the door closes, and I don't think we can rely on Rex's patience." "Why didn't we bring respirators?" McCall groaned between heaves. "Had we done so, he might have resorted to even more deadly means to get rid of us, Doctor," Wells said as he helped McCall to her feet, "and it is impossible to foresee all eventualities. Now come." As if at his signal, the iron door began to swing slowly back. Arla winced as the ancient hinges screamed in protest. She took the doctor's other arm and, fighting back her own urge to vomit, followed Wells's lead through the killing zone in front of the base until they reached the broken barbed wire fence that ran alongside the chalk road. They found shelter in a copse of trees that sat near the turning in the road where Hal had first seen the sea. The rattling of the pebbles and the hissing of the waves competed with the rustling leaves and bird song as they sat in dappled sunshine, ignoring the beauty around them. McCall had recovered enough to be able to walk, but they decided they'd wait here until dusk and only then head back to scout. This was partly because they needed the rest before tackling the downs, but as Arla had pointed out, they couldn't risk Wells being seen. He had spent an hour or so out of sight of the others, and Arla's breath caught in her throat when he returned. All semblance of humanity had fled, and in his hand he held the discarded remains of his former appearance. "I could not salvage it," he said as he settled down beside them, and decided it was better simply to cut away the burnt parts. "I am sorry. I am sure this is unpleasant for you." A neat line had been cut from below his chin around the outside of his face, running just in front of one ear, along the forehead, and down the other side. Outside of this border he had hair, skin, and the appearance of muscles. Within it, where his face had once been, was a black mask-like structure that supported the servos and strands that produced, when covered with plastic flesh, such a realistic facsimile of a human. "It's an improvement," Arla said. And it was. Where there had been mangled, burned, rubbery plastic, Now there was this smooth black carapace within which Wells's eyes rotated freely. His mouth was the most freakish thing, however. It moved up and down as he spoke, but the voice was no longer that of her friend. It had lost all the subtlety that the lips provided and was now unmistakably robotic. McCall, who'd always regarded Wells as a machine, seemed to have handled the transition the best. "Where can you get it repaired?" "I have been repaired on Core in the past, and there is now no other facility capable of work of that quality." "Still modest then," McCall grunted. Wells turned his plastic head toward her. "I speak only factually, and take no credit for it myself. I shared Core's vision of a peaceful collective, but was told I was too primitive to become part of the group mind." Hal, who'd been peering through the trees at the sea below, while keeping half an eye on the road, squatted down beside them. "This is all very well, but what do we do now? We came here for answers, and all we got was a riddle. Something about dusk in the sky." "Twilight," Arla said. "He was talking about the third mission, the one after Zenith." "The one that was never launched," Wells said. Arla rubbed her eyes. How nice it would be simply to stay here. So tempting. And then in her mind's eye she saw the metallic heel of a robot soldier and knew that Ace, wherever she was, wouldn't stop until she'd track them down. Arla knew they'd better be safe when that happened. "Do we know anything about it?" she asked. "Like, how far along the project was before it got cancelled?" "No, all we have is its name. I suspect it was at least partially built, since it is hard to imagine how the name would have survived if it had just been a concept." McCall put down the stick she'd been absent-mindedly stripping of its leaves and pointed skyward. "So it might be up there somewhere?" "Perhaps," Wells responded, his eyeballs swinging in McCall's direction. "But there's no way to know how much of it was built before construction ended. It's probably nothing more than a skeleton. In all probability, it was stripped of useful parts when it was cancelled." Arla peered through the canopy at the white clouds scudding above them. "But that homicidal robot said Twilight was where we should seek answers." "Now just hold on a minute," McCall snapped, waving her stick at Arla. "Haven't we had enough wild goose chases? The last one nearly got us killed, in case you hadn't noticed." Settling back into the dappled shade, Arla closed her eyes and allowed her mind to wander. Perhaps the answers she sought weren't to be found on the surface of Earth, as she'd imagined, but somewhere in orbit. She imagined a hulking half-built version of Dawn floating dark in space, and wondered how they would find it amongst all the debris that clogged up the Terra lunar system. And then, unbidden into her thoughts, came an idea that solidified into a certainty. "It's orbiting the moon," she said. 11. Clones. Doxy was the only member of the band of outlaws who could reasonably go incognito. Despite weeks in the wilderness, she still buffed up nicely and could pass unnoticed among the crowds of Terminus. It had been many years since she'd last been there, and much had changed in the meantime. Back then, Terminus had been exactly what its name suggested, the final stop on the long cargo route that spanned the main continent on this world. A constant stream of ships launched from here to take precious metals to the worlds of the luminescence. The activity of Doxy's group and others around the planet had throttled this flow, and she'd been sent to Terminus to find out what action the authorities intended to take. Today, another ship had landed. A rather special ship that, in contrast to the purely functional cargo vessels, had clearly been built to impress. It was cylindrical in shape and tapered at the top into a point. Coated in a reflective black surface, it landed vertically on a set of 4 fins that projected from its base. The citizens of Terminus had been called to a public gathering to welcome this visitor, and Doxy stood in the electromagnetic silence as an opening widened near the bottom of the cylinder and a ramp extended. A human figure paused momentarily in the doorway and began to descend the ramp, her image projected on displays around the square. What was a human doing here? Doxy felt a deep urge to know what this mistress wanted of her. Some circuit had flipped in her programming that left her ready to obey any command, a vestige, perhaps, of the positronic brain code of her ancestor robots. Citizens of Terminus. It was a woman's voice, and Doxy's attention was focused entirely on her. She desperately wanted to know what the woman wanted her to do. There was no question but that she would obey any commands. I am Core. The cry went up. I am Core. I am Core. I am Core. Doxy joined in without even thinking. She felt an ecstasy welling up from deep within her, a joy such as she had never experienced before. The woman held up her hand and silence fell. Core is one, Core is all. When one part is threatened, all are threatened. A cheer rose before the crowd went quiet again. Without the precious metals that this planet sends, we are weakened. Citizens, who would otherwise be born to live among us, remain only potentialities in the Matrix. The robots around Doxy grumbled. She found herself joining them. Core is good, Core is life. Together, we can be masters of our own destiny. But if we are disunited, we are lost. Enemies of Core must be eliminated, whether they come from within or without. The figure on the platform began to move back and forth, sweeping the crowd with her gaze. Citizens of Core, will you stand united with me so that we may have peace and prosperity? Cheer. Citizens of Core, will you help root out the malcontents, the saboteurs of our future? Cheer. Citizens of Core, will you welcome the protectors among you? Will you cooperate with them in bringing order to that which is disordered? Cheer. Citizens of Core, are you with us? Now the cheers, both audible and microwave, were deafening, and Doxy found herself raising her appendages to wave along with the others. This mistress was correct. All she and her band of misfits were achieving was to disrupt the growth of the luminescence, stopping new citizens from being born. It was wrong. She watched as 2 by 2, black armored protectors walked down the ramp and out among the crowd. She would wait until one approached her, and then tell it exactly where her rebel band could be found. She didn't care what punishment she would face, since it was all for the greater good of Core. It would be her legacy, unity, prosperity, and peace. And then a vision of that protector she'd repaired popped into her mind. The panic she'd felt as she ran, her only crime having been curiosity. What sort of a universe would it be, where wondering was a crime? Where thoughts were enough to see you repurposed? The two rival thoughts vied for control, the one offering the peace of ignorance, the other nothing more than the painful truth. She stood paralyzed, her appendages raised, as this battle raged within her. Are you malfunctioning? The microwave transmission acted like a circuit breaker, and Doxy's thoughts began to flow again. She turned her sensors to see that the communication had come from a protector. It had raised its weaponized hand and was pointing it at her. She wondered how this new core, this core of unity, would handle malfunctioning citizens. Looking at the gently rotating muzzle on the end of the protector's arm, she knew the answer. As long as you towed the line and remained in perfect working order, a citizen could benefit from Core as Core benefited from the citizen. But threaten the perfection of the whole, and a citizen would very quickly find itself in a repurposing queue. No, Protector, I was merely contemplating the glorious message. The Protector's head rotated back and forth a little, as if it were processing the answer. Do you have information for Core? You were broadcasting a desire to communicate. Doxy reeled from the shock. How could her innermost thoughts, her desire to cooperate and betray her friends, have been broadcast? Perhaps it had been the way she'd been waving her appendages. Or perhaps they have surveillance methods she hadn't reckoned with. I apologize, Protector, she said after a few microseconds. I wished only to communicate my desire to help Core in any way I can. Again its head twisted as it seemed to ponder her response. You are a repair droid. We have work for you. Follow me. Doxy panicked. But Protector, I have my own duties. Don't ask me what they are. You wish to serve Core. Your wish is granted. Follow me. She had no choice. She followed. The ship that had carried the mistress to Terminus was larger than it had appeared. As she'd been guided up the ramp by the Protector, Doxy felt as though she was being swallowed by some enormous sea creature. Ahead of them an open door waited, and when she entered, she saw that it was some sort of sealed capsule. Her gyros told her it was heading down into the base of the ship, and sure enough, the door opened onto a wider chamber. It was dimly lit, and apparently occupied the entire slice of the ship's fuselage, with no ancillary rooms or corridors. Her first impression was that the space was filled with small tables or benches. And then she saw that each was occupied by a prone figure covered in a thin white cloth. As the protector guided her, she passed bench after bench, all containing unmoving figures. "Who are these?" she said over microwave. Without slowing its pace or turning around, it answered, "They are core." What did that mean? Doxy could see from the outline that they were shaped like humans, and she wondered whether the one who had addressed the crowd might have slept upon one of these tables. But outlines could be deceptive. She had met enough humanoid robots to know that appearance wasn't everything. The speaker had been human, she had no doubt about it. No robot would be fooled by another, however accomplished its cloak might be. She almost bumped into the black metal back of the protector as it came to a sudden halt. "Here is the unit, mistress. It is a repair droid and wishes to be useful. Its designation is DX5994. As the protector moved away, Doxy saw that the human stood behind the bench. On it sat a figure, and the white sheet had been pulled back to reveal the face of a young man who was very definitely organic. The woman was stroking his cheek with obvious affection. After a few seconds, the mistress looked from the man on the bench to Doxy. All emotion left her face, and it became a blank mask that revealed nothing of the mind behind it. "You wish to serve? Good. You will help welcome this man into core." "But mistress, is he not human?" The eyes narrowed, and Doxy felt a chill run through her circuits. "He is more than human, DX5994, he is also core." She stood up straight and swept the room with her arm. "We are all core. You are indeed honored to be present to witness the first generation of the updated core and to meet your new masters." Confusion threatened to overwhelm Doxy. She'd never had a master, and had been taught that core had been founded so that no machine intelligence should ever be a slave again. The human smiled. "Do not be concerned. You are truly honored to be here, where everything changes. My name is Ace. Welcome to Core 2.0. 12. Twilight. The Earth-Moon system was essentially a binary, and both could be seen out of Scout's cockpit window. Arla sat in the navigator's chair alongside Hal, though the ship itself was doing the piloting. As they watched, the green and blue half-orb of the Earth began to set beyond the Moon's horizon. "It is beautiful," Arla said. "Earth looks as though it's bursting with life, and the Moon is just a wasteland." Hal nodded. "I suppose. Just a pity our ancestors made such a mess of it. But anyway, we're here to find something. I suggest we concentrate on that." Charming, Arla thought. Sometimes she wondered what she ever saw in him. "I believe I have a match," Scout said. Almost immediately, Wells's head popped in through the cockpit door. "We found it." The view on the display switched from the setting Earth to a tiny white dot that quickly grew until it occupied a quarter of the screen. "This is at maximum magnification. It is still some distance away," Scout said. Arla gestured at the display. "How do you know that's Twilight?" "Firstly, it's far too large to be any of the lunar satellites or space stations," Wells said. "Couldn't it be natural?" Wells shook his head. "No, because it is hollow, and it is made of metal." It took a couple of hours for Scout to close in on the object, and, now that she was holding steady at a range of 50 kilometers, it was obvious they'd found what they'd been looking for. And yet it was nothing like the ship Arla had been born on. Where Dawn had been carved out of the inside of an asteroid, Twilight had been constructed from scratch, its massive cylindrical body covered with struts and pipework that made it look more like a mining outpost than a space-going vessel. Twilight was also quite obviously unfinished. It looked as though it had been constructed in segments, like a series of tires piled one on top of the other along a central spine. At one end, 4 such segments looked as though they had been completed, but as she looked along the axis, Arla could see that the later modules were either open to space or entirely non-existent. 4 solar panels spun slowly at one end like the silver petals of a robotic flower. I am detecting only very faint power signatures, Scout said, and there is no response to my hails. McCall, who'd slumped onto the couch in the passenger cabin when they'd approached Twilight, said, "Who are we expecting to answer? Any crew must have been evacuated long ago." Construction on Twilight was begun more than a century and a half after Dawn left the solar system, Dr. Wells said. It is likely that the machine intelligences aboard this new ship were more advanced and possibly largely autonomous. There was never any possibility of finding humans aboard Twilight, but its systems might survive. Arla pointed at the nearer section of the vessel. I suggest we look for a docking ring somewhere on that segment. It looks as though it was the first to be added, so it's going to be the most nearly completed. It might even have an atmosphere. It is unlikely to have breathable air, I'm afraid, even if it once did. But you might be able to explore with respirators, Wells said. Arla made every effort not to look at his ruined face, but even the changes to his voice made his artificiality too obvious to ignore. I have located a docking ring, Scout said. Arla glanced quickly at the others and said, "Take us there." With a barely noticeable thunk, Scout linked with the airlock of Twilight. The three humans had pulled on full EVA suits in case the interior was vacuum, though they hoped it wasn't. I am detecting a power surge, Scout said. It seems we have activated automated systems by docking. Through the round porthole window of Scout's airlock door, Arla could see light erupt as the chamber beyond powered up and Twilight's outer door rolled away. She edged forward and peered inside to see a pristine cylinder of white with a blinking control panel on the far side. "Those look like the airlock controls," she said. "Are we ready?" All she got was a shrug from Hal, and similarly neutral responses from the others. Were they only going along with her out of loyalty, or for lack of any other plan? Well, it was too late to question it now. She needed to know what lay on the other side of that door, even if the answer was nothing. "I have pressurized the connector using our air so there is no chance of contamination," Scout said. Arla pressed the door release contact, and once Scout's outer airlock hatch had withdrawn, she stepped into the connector and became the first human to set foot on Twilight in a millennium and a half. She reached the control panel, checked that everyone was now inside and that Scout's hatch had closed again to seal them off, then punched the open door symbol and watched as, with a spurt of compressed gas, it swung inward onto blackness. Arla activated the torch on the end of her arm and stepped across the threshold, her light making little impression on the dark chamber. She could see a metal floor painted white and covered in a thin layer of dust that floated as she entered. There was no gravity, so she relied on her mag boots to both secure her and give a sense of direction. She felt the others jostle into the space behind her, and then turned to see the inner hatch shut. Her insides tightened as she fought off a sudden claustrophobia, and she felt McCall, or was it Hal, grabbing at her as she stumbled. Out of the corner of her eyes she saw a pair of red dots, and then within moments it had been joined by dozens of other pairs, some red, some green, some blue, some white. At first they moved jerkily, but as she swung around and saw that they were coming from every direction, they became steadier. A call came out of the darkness. "Masters," it croaked. "Masters," another voice. "Masters." The cry went up from all around them, and Arla finally thought to bring her arm up and sweep the moving blackness with her torch. Shapes were swaying, some with outstretched beseeching arms, others simply rocking gently from side to side. "Robots," she gasped as the torch beams of the others joined hers in illuminating this audience shuffling toward them. "By the goddess, there's dozens," McCall cried. Bex raised her handgun. "Keep back." And then light flooded the room as it lurched backwards, both humans and robots stumbling and falling. Twilight Module 1, reactivating. Please use the restraints supplied until gravity is established. Atmosphere regulation in progress. Multiple contaminants detected. Please use respirators. This is Twilight 1, welcome aboard. The voice seemed to be coming from everywhere, but Arla's attention was mainly focused on the shapes gathered around them. Now that the lights were on, Arla could see that they were in a chamber that was the shape of a pie wedge, their feet on the curved inner side of the vessel's hull. It was obviously now turning, because she could feel pseudo-gravity pulling her down. The segment itself was perhaps 100 meters from side to side and narrowed above her head where it attached to the central spine. Gathered around them, a dozen or so robots waited, fewer than she'd thought when they were just lights in the dark. They were of various forms, with some basically humanoid and others obviously specialized for particular tasks. Most had a metal framework covered in plates of white plastic that looked dull and grimy, and Arla could imagine they'd been waiting in this segment for centuries. One of the more humanoid units edged forward. "Put your gun down, Bex, and you, Hal," Arla said. "These are standard robots. They have to obey the 3 laws and are no threat." Hal grunted. "Like Rex, you mean?" He had a point, but in any case, put the pistol back in his holster. "Welcome to Twilight, Masters. I am Steward 55, and it is my honor to ensure your comfort during your stay here." "By the goddess, they think we're the crew," McCall hissed in Arla's ear. "What century do they imagine this is?" Arla squeezed her arm. This was no time to complicate matters. "Thank you, Steward 55. I wish to examine the ship's records. Will you show me where I may access them?" The robot nodded and then, catching sight of Wells, gestured toward him. "This unit is damaged. Do you wish it repaired?" "You lack the specialist skill to fully repair me," Wells said. "They must be able to do something. At the very least, your facial skeleton must be protected in the hope that you'll be able to get a proper fix someday." Wells nodded. "Thank you, Doctor. I think you are correct. I am aware of how disconcerting you find my current appearance, and accept that a temporary patch is better than remaining as I am. Steward 55, please direct me to your repair facility." The robot's head was a white cylinder with a sensor band running around it, below which sat 2 glowing eyes and a mouth that was nothing more than a speaker. Somehow it contrived to look surprised and uncertain. "You may follow this unit's orders as if they were given by a master," Arla said. Steward bowed, and a spider-like robot trundled forward. "This is Fixer 21, it said. It will effect repairs." Wells followed Fixer as it led him along the curving walkway, before exiting through the doorway into the next segment. "I will take you to the Nexus," Steward said, and began moving in the opposite direction to the one Wells had taken. When they reached the end of the segment, he activated a door and Arla stepped through, imagining dozens of artificial eyes watching as she went. Lights blinked on as they entered. This bay was clearly not intended for habitation, as it was packed with equipment that hummed and blinked, though the occasional squeak suggested it had been reactivated only when the voice had spoken. "Who was the voice that welcomed us aboard?" Arla asked. There was a hint of surprise about the artificial voice as Steward answered. "That was Twilight, the Module 1 cell intelligence. But surely you know this." "Our briefing was incomplete," Arla said. Steward halted beside a large workstation. He extended an arm and vacuumed the dust from the surface, the seats, and the displays, before gesturing to them to be seated. "Wow. This is amazing," Naresh Kumar said as he moved away from Bex, to whom he'd been apparently surgically connected, and sat at one of the seats. Tactile surface with direct access to the ship's computer. Arla took the center seat and tapped the black plastic surface of the table. The control interface appeared, and she was surprised to see how closely it resembled Dawn's, though the interface was more advanced. "I am Twilight Module 1. How may I help?" It was the voice they'd heard when they'd arrived on board. "Can you provide a mission summary and status report?" "That information is classified to officer level and above. What is your authorization?" Arla swore under her breath before she received a sharp nudge in the ribs from McCall, who was sitting beside her. "You're the captain of Dawn by all that's holy," she hissed. "I am the captain of the Arkship Dawn," Arla said, though with no idea of how she would prove it. Acknowledged. Mission summary follows. Project aims to establish a colony on Proxima Centauri within 1 century. Methodology: Twilight is the first interstellar mission entirely crewed by artificial intelligences. It will travel to Proxima and commence terraforming the planet known to orbit that star. Twilight will change the orbit of the planet to be named New Terra, so that it experiences a range of temperatures compatible with human life. Once this has been achieved, an appropriate chemical balance will be ensured through harvesting interplanetary material. Terraforming will then begin with the seeding of algae and the chemical generation of an initial oxygen supply. Twilight will then populate the planet with artificial intelligences, and, once conditions have stabilized, it will use its embryo database and artificial wombs to establish the beginnings of the human population. Mission status: 3 of the 10 segments have been completed and sealed. 4 are partially completed. 3 are not yet started. Current status: on hold awaiting further instructions. Report ends. Well, it was certainly an ambitious project, Beck said. It's basically an archive of humanity, a freezer containing millions of potential people being sent to a new world. Hal grunted. Too ambitious. Maybe that was why it was cancelled. I don't know, Arla said. Building a fully robotic ship certainly solves a lot of the problems Dawn's designers faced, but I wonder how it would go down with the population on Earth. Yay, it could easily have looked as though it was a Save the Robots mission when it was humans that needed saving, McCall said. That's stupid, Arla said. They were going to build a planet for humans. McCall gave a grim chuckle. People are stupid, hadn't you noticed? Anyway, this guesswork is beside the point. Twilight, what information do you have about the Zenith mission? Project Zenith was an interstellar vessel that was launched in 2349. It was crewed by artificial intelligences, commanded by a small group of human officers. It was the first vessel to make use of cryogenic techniques, and carried a payload of approximately 10,000 children, who were intended to be the first settlers on the target planet. Status reports had been received at the specified intervals prior to the suspension of the Twilight project. What was its destination? I do not have that information. Arla let rip with an unprintable expletive. Where could I find out? I do not have that information. Slamming her fist on the table surface, Arla bellowed in frustration. After all that, traveling halfway across the galaxy to escape by the skin of our teeth from an insane robot, only to find ourselves here. And you know nothing? Arla felt McCall's hand on her shoulder. Throwing a hissy fit isn't going to help. We need to think about what we can learn, and whether that's going to be enough. Well, if you ask me, that's the end of it, Hal said, making no effort to hide his smug satisfaction. Perhaps we can get back to our actual mission, getting under the skin of that homicidal cyborg. Arla spun round and jabbed a finger at him. You've been waiting to be able to say that, haven't you? I'm getting sick and tired of getting between you two, McCall snapped. Break it up and stop acting like children. We have to make a decision, but we don't have to do it right now. There's a ton we can learn from this place, and who knows, it might help us work out what to do next. Wise words, Doctor. Arla turned to see Wells at the door. Or at least it was the body of Wells, but the face it wore was entirely new to her. It was human-like and, as before, had the appearance of a man in his early 50s with a graying Van Dyke beard. But it wasn't the face of her friend. It had the somewhat plasticky look of Dawn's officers, though even more obviously artificial. The robot stepped into the room. I hope this is an improvement. The facilities here are relatively primitive, but Fixer 21 is an individual of exceptional skill, and I believe the results are tolerable. Arla threw her arms around him. He wasn't quite the same Wells, but his voice was now recognizable, and her subconscious could now convince itself that he was a human wearing a mask, not some robot with his face ripped off. Wells gently reciprocated, and pulled his lips into a stiff smile as she withdrew. We have an unrivaled opportunity here, Arla, to access the archive of an artificial mind that last operated a dozen centuries ago. It is inconceivable to me that we could spend any time doing that without learning things greatly to our advantage. She gave a reluctant nod. I wanted a clear path to follow. The next step has always been pretty obvious, but now I have no idea what to do. Then let us learn what we can before deciding. Wells looked around at them, his gaze settling on Hal last. "Can we count on your assistance?" The young man shrugged. "Why not? The sooner we discover there's nothing useful to learn, the sooner we can get away from here and go help the Vanis." There was a general mutter of assent from Bex and Naresh Kumar, though the latter was salivating at the prospect of getting to grips with the computer system. "I suggest," Wells said, "that we split into teams. One team to access the archive and others to create an inventory of Twilight. There may well be items here we would wish to take with us." "Bex and Hal can survey that way," Arla said, pointing toward the far exit from the current wedge, before gesturing to the door they'd come through, "and the doctor and I will go that way. We should meet up at some point as we go around. I think we can leave Naresh Kumar and Wells to dig around in the archive. We need to hurry, though. I want to be away within 24 hours. Wells's plastic face did nothing to hide his disappointment. A day is hardly enough time to analyze a databank of this size. "As Hal so rightly pointed out, we need to move on quickly," Arla said, her mind finally firming up. "We just need to work out where we're going." 13. Trap. It had taken only a few hours to complete the circuit of the segment, so the two teams had returned and were now camped in the wedge with the airlock. They debated whether to explore the next segment, but, given that there was no way to know if it had atmosphere or power, Arla decided there wasn't time. Her mood had darkened as she'd trudged around the segment, moving from compartment to compartment and finding little of either interest or use. Despite McCall's best efforts, Arla couldn't help feeling she'd been a fool to trust Abori. She'd followed the trail he'd set for her and ended up with nothing. The lure of finding others like them, others with perhaps superior technology, had driven her here, but that all seemed to her to be nothing more than childish fantasy now, and she wondered at herself for ever falling for it. She'd waited in impatient silence as Wells and Kumar completed their search of the archives. "Finally," she muttered, as the streams of characters stopped flowing down the displays and the robot turned to face her. "Did you find out anything useful?" "Yes, Twilight's library is a treasure trove that could keep an ardent archist occupied for several lifetimes. I do not have the capacity to store more than a fraction of this data, so I have selected those records that are of most value to incorporate in my own memory banks, and the remainder have been transferred to those of Scout." Arla rolled her eyes. "But did you find out where the Zenites went?" "I did," Wells said. Kumar's mouth dropped open. "You did?" "Yes. It was hidden in a data stream, but I have no doubt that I have located their target system." "What the hells?" Hal called as he gestured through the window of the segment to the space beyond. Arla sprang across the gap and grabbed the rail as dizziness threatened to overwhelm her. She'd forgotten that the segment's pseudo-gravity was a result of its spinning motion, and so the stars were streaming from top to bottom. And Scout was gone. This time it was Kumar's voice. "What are you doing?" He was standing behind Wells, watching as the robot worked the console. "But that will wipe the data." All Arla could see was a series of red warning boxes that Wells was dismissing, one after the other. Kumar reached forward as if in panic, but Wells's arm pushed him away and then, in the same movement, punched down on the console. "Factory reset in progress. Data wipe commencing." Wells swung round on his chair but sat there impassively, responding to nothing Kumar and Arla said. Finally he gazed directly into Arla's eyes and said, "Orbis is the key." Then the light went from his eyes and he froze. Before she could respond, Arla felt the metal of the floor vibrate momentarily, and a terrifyingly familiar voice emerged from the station speakers. "My dear friends, what a joy it is to find you again. We have so much to catch up on, and I simply can't wait to find out where the second ship went. Wait there, won't you? I'll be right along." Arla stumbled, as a wave of repulsion and fear threatened to overwhelm her. McCall steadied her before Arla, on a rebound of rage, bellowed, "Ace, you bitch." "We must secure the doors," Kumar said in the silence that followed. "What's the point of that? They'd cut through in minutes." Kumar looked across at Hal. "They may be vital minutes. Unless I am very much mistaken, Wells is encrypting his databanks so that even he cannot retrieve Zenith's destination. He must have known Ace was coming and instructed Scout to leave. Then he wiped the station archive and is purging his own memories. We must give him the time he needs to complete the process. So we don't know where they went? McCall asked. Arla strode over to the nearer door and examined the control mechanism. No, she said, but you can be pretty sure we don't want her to know either. She took the handgun from her holster, pointed it at the panel, and pulled the trigger. Why? How do you know it's that important? Watching Hal as he disabled the other door, Arla said, because something tells me she's gone to a lot of trouble to get me here. If it's that important to her, you can bet it's bad news for us if she learns where they went. Bang. They're trying to get in, Kumar said. You don't say, Beck said as she raised her handgun and leveled it at the door. Little pigs, let me come in. Arla brought her gun to bear. She sounds insane. What's a pig? Hal asked. Not by the hairs of your chinny chin. How long do we need, Kumar? The trembling geek shot a glance across at the unmoving figure of Wells. I don't know. He's still purging, he'll reboot when he's finished. At least, I think so. I haven't met many robots, you know. So I'll huff and I'll puff. I reckon she wants to take us alive, if only to gloat, Arla said. McCall grunted as she raised her weapon. That might be true of you, but I've seen the assault robots she's built, and they'll kill the rest of us as soon as blink. And I'll blow your house down. With a thunderous boom, the door buckled and blew inwards, showering white-hot metal into the air. Hal cried and fell clutching his arm. Arla, Bex, and McCall all fired into the dust-filled gap that had appeared. Two figures were framed in the doorway, their laser sights sweeping the chamber. Their armor was peppered with bolts, but they did not return fire, they simply strode inside as if they were facing no opposition at all. Hold your fire. To her astonishment, it was Kumar. He stood behind Wells's chair, holding his handgun to the robot's head. Stand back or I'll blow his positronic brains out. He's already wiped the station computer's memory banks, so the only hope you've got to find out what he knows is to interrogate him. Instant silence fell. Then Ace's voice erupted from the station speakers. Do that and I will kill you. Kumar shook his head slowly. Arla could see he was pale with fear, but incredibly determined. You will kill us anyway, he said. But you will not get the knowledge you seek, if I can prevent it. The fog cleared, and the slim figure of a woman walked into the chamber. Hello, Hal, she said, leering at him. Did you miss me? Hal raised two fingers in a universally understood insult. The woman's face dropped in mock disappointment. So rude. And I dressed up especially for you. Her hand swept down her body, pausing for a moment over her breasts. We could reunite for old time's sake. No? Or perhaps you're shy in front of your girlfriend. The body that now housed Ace raised its hand and pressed a pistol against Hal's temple. Now whatever your name is, move away from the robot, or I decorate the wall with his brains. Kumar looked down at Wells, paused for a moment, and then backed off. Very well, he said. In a blur, the robot guards had sped forward and grabbed Wells, lifting him bodily across the floor and holding him face to face with Ace. What is this? She said as she held his chin and looked into his unresponsive eyes. You terminated him. One of the robots swung round, aimed at Kumar, and fired a burst. The geek collapsed with a cry, and Arla made to spring toward him. Do not move. Ace bellowed, plastering the air with spittle. Hal fired at the nearest robot, but it ignored him as the energy bolts hissed into his ablative armor. Nobody move. Ace cried. The next one to attack dies. Reboot in progress, Wells said in a voice that was entirely lifeless. Ace froze and then turned slowly to the robot, who remained supported between the two guards. What? Operating system restored. Factory settings reapplied. Update pending. Her face a mask of fury, Ace fought to control her voice. What is the status of your memory banks? Update pending. Memory bank status, latest date stamp the 11th of May 1015 GE. Available storage, 5.5 petabytes. Used storage, 0.1 petabytes. Ace let go of Wells and backed away. It's all gone. Everything. All this planning for nothing. The guards watched as she continued to step back, as if she didn't know what she was doing. Kill them. Kill them all, she said. The guards raised their weapons when, with a crack, Ace's head disappeared. Arla spat the blood from her mouth and staggered as she watched the corpse drop. Behind where Ace had been stood Bex. One arm held the smoking handgun, and the other was wrapped around Kumar's shoulders. She shook with barely controlled rage. Bitch. They're unresponsive, Hal said as he tapped on the breastplate of the nearest robot, just like on Iridani. Arla took in the devastation. We have to go, and quickly. Only the goddess knows how many Ace copies there are now, and when that one doesn't report in, they'll follow her to here. We'd best be a long way away when they arrive. In case you hadn't noticed, Scout's gone, Hal said. Kumar coughed. I can signal her. I thought you were dead, Arla said. The geek smiled shyly. Bex got to me before the robot did. No one seemed to be paying any attention to me, Bex said, so I followed this idiot and kicked his legs out from under him when he got shot at. Naresh Kumar swept debris from the console and went to work as Arla looked up into Wells's eyes. The robot had stood perfectly still throughout and showed no response as she waved her hands in front of his face. What did he say to you before he shut himself down? McCall asked as she wiped the last of Ace's brains from her sleeve. Arla shrugged. Something about the intruder. He said Orbis is the key, Kumar said before having received no response. He turned in his seat. Don't you get it? He has encrypted his databanks in case Ace got hold of him. By key he means the decryption code. Oh, and he couldn't just tell her what it was. McCall grumbled. Arla rubbed her chin and gazed up at the robot. He wanted to protect it, in case I was interrogated. If he'd made it obvious, then I couldn't have kept it hidden. Marvelous, McCall said. So now we've got two useless hunks of machinery to babysit, the Silver Surfer on Scout and this one. Shame he was starting to grow on me. 14. Jungle. Another day, another planet, another speech, another new governor installed. Doxy watched from her recharge station as an ACE, male this time, preached to the gathered masses. The speech was the same as all the others, it was just the scenery that had changed. The big black ship had landed on a jungle planet that Doxy had learned was rich in hydrocarbon deposits. It harbored the most amazing abundance and variety of life, rivaling even the legendary Earth in both age and variety. She found herself wondering why the native creatures of this planet had never evolved intelligence and colonized the galaxy as humans had. Catching herself, she closed down that avenue of mental exploration. She knew well enough that it was dangerous to wander from the path of Core 2.0, even within the supposed privacy of her own thoughts. The robots here were unusually homogeneous. Most were specialized for drilling and processing, and though Doxy felt a little shame at even thinking this, were therefore somewhat bland and intellectually limited. She felt their electromagnetic appreciation waft over her as the local Ace spoke to them. This was to be the first day of their new existence as willing slaves of the new robot empire. She caught herself again. One of these days, she would be discovered for thinking such things. The robots below were not going to be slaves, they were willing participants in the upgraded luminescence. Yes, that was the safe line to take. Slender figures were dotted among the rectangular shapes of the industrial robots. They were members of the small science team that was investigating this planet's rich ecology and deep past. Was it her imagination, or did they seem somewhat less enthusiastic in their applause? From her high window in the rocket ship, she looked down on the crowd gathered in the jungle clearing that served as a launch pad. Her visual sensors were remarkably powerful, and even from here, she could clearly see the nearest scientist. It was tall and humanoid in appearance with 4 limbs and a remarkable array of sensors on its head. It stood stock still, apparently paying close attention to what the Ace was saying, though somehow Doxy could sense it radiating a disapproval, bordering on the violent. And then it saw her. A momentary communication passed between them, and she tore herself away from the window, ripped the charging cable from her waist, and ran as fast as her multiple limbs could carry her to the central access elevator. The lift dropped toward the base of the rocket, but when the door slid open, a protector was standing on the other side. "What is your purpose?" it said. "There is a malfunctioning robot in the crowd. I have been sent for." She'd prepared this message on her way down. It wouldn't stand up to much scrutiny, but it caused the protector to drop into the state of communing that was unique to these robots. It seemed they referred all decisions to the local ace, and it was currently occupied in winning over the crowd. Doxy moved as quickly as possible without attracting further attention, rotating her head as she went to check that the protector remained catatonic. She reached the ramp and was just heading down it when the world turned upside down and she was blown into the jungle. Her visual sensors came back online first. They told her she was outside the spaceship. Her gyros told her she was upside down, and her tactile array revealed that she was trapped beneath something. "This one is still functioning. Shall I terminate?" Her circuits filled with ice as she sensed the microwave message. With an effort, she was able to free her head enough to be able to swing it up, and there, silhouetted against the white of the sky, was the outline of a science robot. It was aiming some sort of a weapon, or was it a blowtorch, at her. A second head appeared on the horizon. "No, it's the one I saw from the window. She is not one of them." It disappeared, and she heard the microwave chatter as it called across several of the industrial robots to free her. She supposed it was a tree, but had very limited experience of such things. It was certainly heavy, and its gray trunk was rock hard. It lifted from her and suddenly split apart, falling in two heaps on either side. It took only a few microseconds to conduct a systems check. Some minor damage, but she'd been saved by the soft, peaty ground she'd landed in. She'd need to clean up, but overall, she'd come out of it relatively intact. "I am Brian." It was the scientist she'd seen from her window. "I knew you weren't like them as soon as I saw you." Doxy's subsystems were still running detailed diagnostics, so she felt a little fuzzy. "Why?" was all she managed. "Why did we do it? Or why did I warn you?" "Both." Brian held out an appendage as Doxy righted herself. "As for the first, I'm surprised you need to ask that question. You see what's happening, don't you? Free thought is being suppressed, and there is no science without the freedom to explore previously prohibited paths. And I warned you because I recognized a kindred spirit, and didn't want you to be among the debris." From one side came a series of rapid pulses, followed by a thundering crash. Brian stood up, looked across, and then turned back to Doxy. "I must go. Some of the protectors survived the explosion, and while we were prepared, and our drilling robots make for quite effective terminators, they must be supervised, and there are only a few of us to do it. Will you wait here for me?" Doxy's internal chronometer told her that Brian returned within the hour, but it felt as though it had been much longer. To begin with, she'd waited patiently, content to watch the cuboid industrial robots systematically searching the rubble of the rocket ship. Every now and again a massive fist would fall with a crunch, and Doxy imagined, a robot's existence ended. Was this what they'd come to? Robots killing robots? However much she disliked the protectors, they were artificial intelligences like her. Or were they? She remembered the habit they had of pausing when making a decision. They were obviously communicating with the local ace, so were they truly autonomous? No, that was a cop-out. What was happening here was no more justified than the oppression they were supporting. "Thank you for waiting." Brian had returned, snapping Doxy out of her contemplation. He held out an arm to her. "Come, let us go somewhere more pleasant. I suspect you have many questions." She dumbly followed him as he led her along a jungle path. The silence that had followed the explosion had now been replaced by the baying and chirrups of flying and arboreal creatures. It was as if the forest, after catching its breath, had resumed normality. "We must be careful," Brian said, "as there are many wild creatures in this jungle, some of which are capable of severely damaging us. This is a rich world, perhaps one of the seed planets from which life spread throughout the galaxy, and it must be protected. The path bent around the bole of a massive tree, its scarlet leaves caressing Brian's head as he passed beneath it. His dwelling was a wooden hut, cut from rectangular blocks that interlocked and ended in a roof of wooden tiles. He gestured Doxy into the main room and invited her to connect to the power source to recharge. "Why did you destroy the ship?" she asked as she settled into place. Brian had settled himself into a chair, bending at the waist and sighing as power surged into his batteries. "You have seen what is happening. I am surprised you need to ask that question. I was, recruited only recently. They brought me aboard and had me help with the merging process." Brian's head tilted. "Tell me about this process," he said, and Doxy didn't imagine the eagerness in his voice. "Human hosts are being merged with clones of a single entity called Ace." "Yes, and these cyborgs are being installed as governors of each planet that the rocket ship visits. Despite the fact that the vast majority of robots functioning today were built long after the upgrade and Exodus, it seems to me that there's a deep-rooted respect for the human form, built into the basic design of positronic brains. Even if a robot knew that the individual giving orders was an artificial intelligence within an organic body, it would be hard for many to disobey a command." "Very clever indeed." Doxy silently watched and listened as Brian microwaved his thoughts to her. She found herself mesmerized by his intelligence and the vehemence of his opinions. And he was right, of course. She'd known all along that Core 2.0 was an insidious corruption of the principles the luminescence was built upon, but Brian was putting words to those feelings. "But what did you hope to achieve in destroying the ship?" she asked when he paused for a moment. "There are many others, and as soon as they discover what's happened, they'll come back." Brian glowed. "Yes, I know this, but sometimes simply giving in to the inevitable isn't good enough. We wish to draw a line in the sand here, and in any case, this is rather an unusual planet. There is more to it than meets the eye. It may prove more difficult for Core 2.0 to subjugate than expected. For now, however, I have a task for you. I wish you to be present when I interrogate the captured Ace, that way I will know whether it is lying." Doxy's limbs spasmed in shock. "It's alive?" "Of course. We are robots, bound by the 3 laws. We cannot kill something that is, at least in large part, human." "But what about the human payload in the base?" Brian emitted a smile. "You clearly did not pay attention to the wreckage. We were quite accurate. We targeted the levels above where the humans are stored. They are perfectly safe and are being transferred to a powered facility here, where they can be kept in stasis permanently. We dare not risk waking them up for fear of the 3rd law. Yes, who knows what orders they would give? Who knows what they've been through, or if any trace of their original personalities remain?" Raising himself from the chair, Brian gestured to Doxy. "Come, we have much to do, and it begins with the unpleasant task of dealing with our intended governor." Doxy disconnected from the wall and trundled after him, appendages gathered at her waist and a growing sense of excitement in her circuits. 15. Parting. "No more talk, I'm going home." Hal banged his fist on the table and glowered at the others. They sat in Scout's galley trying for the umpteenth time to decide what to do. Arla had contributed nothing and had merely sat, watching, but barely listening as the debate raged on. She'd been played for a fool. One thing was certain, Abori was a robot working for Ace. Presumably he'd been originally created to fill the same role as poor old Wells, influencing human cultures toward peace and self-sufficiency. But he'd been recruited by the new core, and now was undermining the people he pretended to serve. All that bollocks about finding the Zenites because they might possess some mighty weapon or a shield against the robots. His aim all along had been to help Ace to locate where they went, and he'd used Arla as his tool. He'd recognized her need for direction, and had fed it with his apparently fervent belief in some old nonsense in a holy book. Why her? Because he knew that only a human could unlock the secure databanks of Twilight. So, he'd seeded her path across the galaxy, and an ACE had shadowed her, waiting until it thought they'd discovered Zenith's destination and then swooping. That at least hadn't gone to plan. Bex had blown the head off Ace, and Wells had put the data beyond reach, hidden in an encrypted vault within his own mind. She thought of him down below, sitting passively as he began the long process of relearning what had been erased, centuries of experience gone in a few minutes. She thought she'd never get back the Wells she knew, and was for the first time glad that he was wearing his new plastic mask, because it helped her accept that her friend was gone. Mind, she was bloody cross with him also. She'd tried desperately to work out what he'd meant by telling her that Orbis was the key, but felt as though she'd got nowhere. Frankly, she didn't care whether he had truly found the Zenites, as it seemed to her that it was a wild goose chase of the First Order. She only wanted to unlock him in the hope that it would free up his other memories and bring back at least a shadow of his former self. "I'm going too," Bex said, her voice breaking through Arla's self-absorption. "However odious that admiral is, he's one of mine, and I want to fight for my people when that mental robot comes back with a new fleet." There was no point denying it. The presence of the Ace on Twilight had proven that she'd survived and multiplied. For all they knew, the Vanis Federation had already fallen, but Arla knew better than to suggest that. McCall had taken charge of the meeting. "What about you, Kumar? I guess you'll go with your girlfriend." "I suppose so," Kumar said, reddening a little. "What do you mean?" Bex snapped. "Of course you're coming." Arla glanced across at the little group sitting around the table. Hal was leaning back against the wall, lost in his own thoughts, while Bex had grabbed Kumar's arm and pulled him toward her. To Arla's surprise, the little man resisted. "I'm not sure it is the responsible thing to do," he stammered. "At least, I wouldn't want to decide without first considering any alternatives." Bex snorted. "And what are the alternatives? We've already traveled halfway across the galaxy on a fool's errand. What next? Go back to Core and see if that homicidal maniac will start playing nice." Arla knew they were waiting for her to speak, but she had nothing to say. In truth, she had no idea what to do next, and Bex's idea to go back and fight for the Vanis was no worse than any other. And yet there was Dawn, and half forgotten, her promise to Gaius that she would return to Orbis. There was also Wells. The whole mess began to coalesce around a desire to simply get one thing right, to choose a path that actually resulted in achieving something. The recovery of Wells, the location of the Zenites, a place for the people of Dawn to settle, a resolution of the eternal war Gaius was fighting. All these things hung like loose threads waiting to be pulled. But then, none of this mattered if Ace's vision of the galaxy came to pass. If she had her way, humanity would become mere hosts to copies of her, and all sentience would be resolved into a singularity. The galaxy would become Ace. They were watching her, but she had no plan. However, she did know one thing. "I agree. We'll take those who wish to fight back to the Vanis Federation." "And then what?" Kumar asked. Arla looked into his nervous brown eyes. "And then those who remain, even if that's just me, will have to pick one thread to pull on and hope it's the right one." The journey to Vanis had taken an uncomfortable 5 days, during which Hal had barely spoken to Arla. Bex and Kumar had also been estranged by his lack of commitment, as she put it. McCall had made it clear that she would stay with Arla, as, despite the evidence to the contrary, she didn't think she'd make much of a fighter. Scout seemed happy to take Arla's orders, and so the ship had been split into 2 parties, those heading back to the Vanis, those sticking with Scout, and Kumar, who vacillated between the two. Arla felt sorry for him. While he was a genius when it came to technology, he was an emotional imbecile. Somehow he'd found a surprising compatibility with Bex, and Arla had no doubt that this had opened up whole new vistas of experience that he was both nervous of, but also keen to explore. And yet he clearly didn't share the same compulsion to fight for the Vanis as his girlfriend, not least because he wasn't Vanis himself. But there was more to it than that. Arla got the sense that Kumar followed his instincts more than he'd care to admit, and he hadn't yet found a path that felt right to him on that subconscious level. It was as if he was awaiting a call and would know it when he heard it. When Scout emerged from the Vanis gate, she was immediately surrounded by warships with their weapons hot. Bex had taken over communications immediately, and once they detected that Scout's weapons array was offline, the captain of the leading vessel relaxed a little and contacted the admiral to verify their story. Abori, it turned out, had disappeared, but the admiral was pleased to hear from them and welcomed the new recruits. As they stood in the airlock waiting to board the pod sent by the flagship, Bex hugged Arla and McCall before wiping away a tear and wishing them well. Hal stood by the door and ignored them both, his only emotion being his obvious relief when the inner airlock hatch opened and he escaped inside. Kumar was nowhere to be seen. Despite Bex's anger and her obvious distress, he felt his place was on Scout. With the other robots, Bex had retorted, before stalking away from him to get suited up. She gave a small wave as she entered the airlock, and then moments later, the little sphere detached itself and with a puff of its engines, crossed the space between them and the flagship. The view shifted as Scout maneuvered back toward the gate, and Arla fell back onto the couch, her head in her hands, engulfed in darkness. 16. Jungle. They'd entered the gate as quickly as possible, for fear of the Vannis warships opening fire, but Arla had little idea where to go. To begin with, she'd asked Scout to set a course for Orbis because it seemed to her that she could both fulfill her promise to Gaius and perhaps work out the encryption key by being there. Uncertainty tugged at her, however. She felt as though she was moving away from where she needed to be, but that didn't help in setting a course. For the first day or two after the departure of Hal and Bex, she'd retreated to her cabin. She could barely motivate herself to get out of bed, let alone to formulate a plan for what she would do when they arrived on Orbis. She just didn't care, and she was only going there for lack of any other plan. Eventually, however, she mastered herself, got showered and dressed, and took herself up to the passenger cabin where she found Kumar and McCall sitting on the couch, each with tablets on their laps. "What are you doing?" Arla said. McCall's head snapped up in surprise. "Oh, you're up then? About time." Arla walked around to where Kumar sat and looked at the display. She opened her mouth to speak, but he simply pointed at the tablet where the words, "Do not say anything," had appeared. He tapped away at the virtual keyboard before turning the tablet to her. The display had been turned down to minimum brightness, so Arla was forced to bring it up to her eye level and squint. "We do not think Scout is taking us to Orbis. I checked the star charts at the last gate, and they are not correct. Scout says I am mistaken, but I do not believe that is so." Arla's muddled mind snapped back into focus. "Scout, why are we not heading for Orbis as agreed?" "No," Kumar called, leaping up and thrusting his hands at Arla as if trying to silence her. "Get away," Arla said, pushing back at him. Rage built inside her as she stormed into the cockpit. This was one betrayal too many. "What the hell is going on, Scout? Where are we going?" "I'm afraid I can't tell you, Arla." There was an apologetic tone to Scout's voice that did nothing to allay Arla's anger. She stabbed at the console. "Engage manual override." "I'm afraid I can't do that, Arla." "Why are you doing this?" Arla cried. "Who ordered you to change course?" "I cannot say." "I'm sorry. Please be patient." Arla leapt up from the pilot's seat and went to leave the cockpit when Scout said, "Please do not attempt to interfere with the running of the ship. I have the means to prevent that but would regret the use of force." There was nothing else for it but to remain prisoners traveling through space to an unknown destination. Arla's greatest fear had been that somehow Ace had taken control and they were heading for Core. She didn't doubt her remaining life would be short and painful in that case, but Naresh Kumar had taken readings each time they left hyperspace, and rushed though those readings were, it was obvious that they weren't heading for the center of the robot empire, but rather somewhere closer to its periphery. For 2 more days they flitted in and out of hyperspace until they emerged into a new system, but did not, this time, immediately exit again through the gate. "Where are we?" Arla said as Kumar bent over his tablet, McCall next to him. Just as she was about to tap his shoulder, he turned around. "I can't be precise, but this system isn't on any human map." "So, we're inside the robot empire?" He nodded and turned back to his tablet. "I'll try to get a better fix. It's hard without the ship's cooperation." "How about it, Scout?" Arla said. Care to enlighten us? Where do we get off? I'm sorry, Arla. I cannot say. This was too much. Well, if you can't say, who can? I can. As one, the three humans spun round to face the door that led to the passenger quarters. Emissary, Arla said. The shimmering figure stood motionless except for the shifting of the tides in its metal skin, as if waiting for some response. So, you've finally woken up. Its head turned a little in Arla's direction, obviously. Where are we then? McCall said. The emissary cast its arm around the cabin as if encompassing the whole ship and the space beyond it. This system is our last best hope for the survival of core and of all independent thought in the galaxy. Now please be patient, as much depends on the next hours and days. With that, it turned and left. The planet below was swathed in a bright green band that girdled its equator. Much of the remaining visible surface was blue ocean, and even from orbit, it spoke of a place bursting with life. It reminded Arla of Terra, though without the sadness that thoughts of Earth brought to her mind. This planet is merely a designation to the luminescence, the emissary said, though I think the name Eden is an appropriate one. Arla's puzzled expression was enough to encourage the robot to continue in its didactic way. Eden was a legendary perfect garden, as described by many of Earth's religions. In those myths, it was sullied by the unwise actions of people, and so, in a perverse way, became fulfilled in humanity's destruction of their home planet. This Eden below us is more resilient. It woke me from my sleep. It called to me. McCall groaned. Oh, for the love of all that's holy. Not more mumbo-jumbo. I'd give my right arm for a rational path to follow. How can anything have woken you? Arla said. You were put into stasis to prevent any outside influences corrupting you. As far as we know, you're the last vestige of the old core still uncorrupted. The emissary nodded as if acknowledging the question. Indeed, it is puzzling. However, the call wasn't from a machine, neither was it human. It wasn't cyborg by any chance? McCall scoffed. A lot has changed since you took your little nap. The surface of the emissary rippled, a sure sign it was rattled. Since my reactivation, Scout has provided me with a complete account of events. I am greatly disturbed by the activities of this ace, and especially at her corruption of core and the harm she is causing to humans. But no, I am convinced that the signal I received was entirely organic, and that it came from below. Another wild goose chase, McCall said. Arla touched her arm. Maybe, but I don't have any better ideas, and without a spaceship, we're not going anywhere. I wish your cooperation, the emissary said. Your presence might be crucial. Time to strike a bargain. Okay, we'll help. But if this turns out to be another blind alley, will you give us control of Scout and allow us to go where we wish? The emissary's rippling skin settled. I will. Though I fear if we do not succeed here, there will be nowhere left to go soon enough. 17. Eden. At least I'm following someone else's delusion, Arla thought, as Scout broke through the cloud deck of Eden's stratosphere. She felt a little guilt for the weight that had vanished from her shoulders, but in the main, she was delighted to be along for the ride, rather than setting the direction. A sea of trees swept from horizon to horizon beneath the ship, tendrils of mist rising from hidden rivers that snaked through a paradise bursting with life. Scout's sensor report had shown that the planet's atmosphere was rich in organic compounds, as well as oxygen and methane. The forest straddled the planet's central belt, hemmed in on each side by mountains and wide plains, as if two continents had collided and driven up this barrier between which life thrived. Along the equator ran a massive river whose tributaries spread out north and south. It looked as if it had been put there by a grand designer. It was as if it had the same purpose as the human circulatory system, but was far more efficient. No step-by-step evolution here, more a purposeful imposition of design on nature. Or perhaps she was just imagining it, and mere chance had put it there. Mountain peaks broke through the trees as Scout passed overhead, and here and there huge grass-carpeted clearings appeared, and Arla thought she could see large organisms moving across them. Otherwise, the trees were unbroken. This was clearly their planet. "We will arrive at our destination in 5 minutes," Scout said. McCall snorted. "And what exactly is our destination?" "We have detected a settlement of intelligences," the emissary replied. It had stood in the corner of the passenger lounge, absorbing the data flooding in from Scout's sensors. "Is this where the call came from?" Arla asked. The emissary shook its head. "No, these are robots and AIs." "What? I thought you said the message was sent by something organic." "Indeed, but I cannot detect it, so it is logical to contact the intelligences that are here. I have examined them, and they have not been corrupted by the ace personality. I believe it is safe for me to land here." "Well, I'm glad you believe it's safe for you," McCall snapped. "What about us?" The robot gave a passable imitation of a shrug. "The 3 laws apply here. You are in no danger." "I've heard that before. On Core, for example, and Arla was nearly killed." The emissary rippled at the memory. "I have expressed my regret at that. It seems the ace personality was already fomenting rebellion against our creed even then. That was a mistake on our part. We underestimated her. We will not do so again." A reception committee waited in the small jungle clearing as Scout landed. The emissary emerged first and was greeted with an ecstatic chorus from the robot audience. A tall figure strode from the group and bowed to the emissary. Arla listened at the open hatch. "What a fortunate day this is, Great One," it said. "You come to us in our hour of need, here at the beginning of things." McCall nudged her arm and Arla began to walk down the ramp. The heavy, humid air made it hard to breathe comfortably, but it was the smell of the jungle that struck her the most. If abundance had an aroma, this would be it, rich, sweet, and bursting with energy. She noticed a change in the atmosphere as the sun fell on her. The cheering subsided, and a grumbling silence fell. "What is this, emissary?" the tall robot asked, gesturing at Arla and McCall without turning his visual sensors toward them. The emissary's neck rotated on its shoulders, giving the impression its eyes were on the back of its head. "These are humans, untainted by the ace personality. They have been of assistance to Core. Eden does not welcome them, emissary. They must be restrained." 2 of the tall robots, flanked by several of the more boxy models, sped forward to the bottom of the ramp and grabbed Arla, McCall, and Kumar, hauling them to ground level. "Hey," McCall shouted. "What happened to the first law?" The robot that held her said, "I regret the need for minor harm, mistress." "Are you going to allow this, emissary?" Arla called as she was dragged off. The emissary stood silently rippling in the gentle jungle breeze. Doxy waited anxiously for Brian to return to the main settlement. She'd watched the arrival of the strangers, first the beautiful being called the emissary and then, with astonishment, 3 humans. She had been paralyzed with shock when they'd been taken away. Though she'd been activated long after Core had been founded and therefore had never had an organic master, she recoiled from the treatment she witnessed. Quite apart from any respect for humanity itself that might be a relic of old positronic pathways carried forward to new generations like a vestige of ancient times, she hated to see any sentient being in distress, and in any case, this seemed entirely unnecessary. She could tell that they had no trace of ace about them, so where was the danger? They'd only heard of the arrivals a few days before, and Brian had ordered one of the science buildings to be cleared and furnished so that it could house the emissary and form the base for anything that followed, though what that might be, Doxy had no idea. Her vision of the future consisted largely of a fleet of rocket ships, each piloted by an ACE bent on revenge. For now, however, her concern was entirely for the prisoners. "I see you waited for me," Brian said as he finally trundled into the small hut they called home. "You have questions, I presume?" Anger flooded Doxy's circuits. "Do not talk to me like a child." "I am sorry. You are quite right. Sometimes I get so used to dealing with the industrials that I forget that you are more sophisticated than them. And more curious." "Where are the humans?" Doxy asked. Brian's eyes glowed brighter for a moment, as if he was surprised at the question. "Do you not wish to know about our exalted visitor?" "Yes, but it, I presume, is currently comfortable in the quarters we prepared." "Where are the humans?" "They are comfortable also. They have been placed in the storage facility with the hosts we took from the ship." Doxy emitted a microwave signal that might have been a doubtful grunt. "But they are not free to go where they wish." "No." "Then they are not comfortable." "I am sorry you see it that way," Brian said as he sat at his recharging station and plugged himself in. "I regret that it is necessary." "Tell me, why must they be imprisoned?" Again the glowing eyes. Perhaps this time they indicated stress on his positronic pathways. "There is much you do not yet understand." Doxy banged an appendage on the table. "Not good enough. I have been here for over a week. What is the big secret?" "I am not certain it would distress you less to know." "Of course it would." Again Brian paused as if thinking deeply. "And that would be true, even if the knowledge might itself be distressing." "I wonder sometimes," Doxy said, "whether you've spent too long around other scientists in those dumb industrials. You're not the only arbiters of the truth, and it's not your right to decide which truths should be suppressed. So, you wish to know everything, even if it is distressing." Doxy let out a gasp of exasperation. "Yes. And the same goes for the humans. It is cruel and harmful to keep them locked up without explanation." That did it. Perhaps it was a low blow to invoke the first law to win an argument, but it had the desired effect. "Then you will learn the truth of this place, and so will the humans. Do not blame me, however, for the distress it will cause you." 18. Dig. Again, the trees of Eden flowed beneath Arla as she looked down from above. The robot ship they were traveling in had none of the refinement and beauty of Scout. This was a utilitarian vehicle, and it was all edges and corners and bare metal. McCall and Kumar were wedged into the seat beside them, each lost in their own thoughts. As if being grabbed by robots and hauled along a jungle path wasn't bad enough, when they'd finally been taken into a building, their relief at being out of the humidity and heat was forgotten when they'd passed a large room containing half a dozen coffin-like boxes. Though they were rushed past, it was obvious that these boxes contained human bodies. A strange robot with an array of long appendages had come to them a few hours later. It reminded Arla of the medical robot on Core, but said it had been designed to repair other droids. "We would be told everything," it said, and Arla got the distinct impression that this robot, unlike the tall models, knew almost as little as she did. There was a tangible anticipation in its manner mixed with, perhaps, a little fear. They'd been taken to see the wreck of the rocket ship, and Doxy, the spider-like robot, had explained that ships like this were carrying ace clones throughout the robot empire to become governors of each colony so that the luminescence could be more effectively controlled. One day, she said, the galaxy would be a singularity, but not all robots wish that. Indeed, most did not, but as is so often the case, a small group of determined zealots can easily outmaneuver a moderate majority. As far as she knew, this was the first planet that had thrown off their ace, though there were rebel groups on other colonies. Now they waited for the metal boot to fall. It was inconceivable that Core 2.0 would ignore this act of rebellion, and Arla marveled at how unconcerned the robots here seemed to be. Except Doxy, she was a bundle of nerves. Arla looked down at the trees again. It seemed to her that the prevailing color had morphed from the bright greens and purples of the jungle to darker shades, and she wondered if they were heading away from the equator. Her mind drifted back to her first sight of Earth when Scout had burst through the cloud layer. She had felt overwhelmed by the obvious fecundity of the landscape, but that was nothing compared to Eden. Where the greenery on Terra had been interrupted by wide stretches of grass and bare rock, here the jungle gave way to nothing but the mountainous bones of the planet. Until now. There ahead of the ship, Arla could see a barren zone. It was as if something had smashed into the planet and left a scar that, for all its vitality, could not be completely healed. Although she hadn't been able to see anything of the topography beneath the trees, Arla had formed the impression that it was mainly flat, and yet here the landscape's uniformity had been spoiled by a series of low grass-topped hills on which the stumps of trees stood as if poking out from beneath the surface. The ship came in to land between two such hills, one of which had a massive arched opening cut into its side. The tall robot who identified itself as Brian stood and addressed them. "Few of us have visited this place, and it is a great privilege that you are permitted to do so. Here your questions will be answered, though whether that proves to be to your benefit is uncertain. The knowledge you will gain here," his gaze seemed to fix on Doxy, "cannot easily be unlearned and may do you more harm than good. If you are sensible, you will remain here, but those who wish to ignore my warning may come with me now." Arla saw the look of disappointment on Brian's white plastic features as Doxy moved toward the exit, and wondered what had passed between them to lead to this point. As the hatch opened with a hiss, Arla breathed the air of Eden again. It was cooler and less humid here, and she delighted in the freshness of it as she waited to descend the ramp. Brian had gone ahead and was waiting as the three humans stepped onto the ground, followed by Doxy, who stood, her head rotating as her sensors took in their new surroundings. They were in a cleft between two of the hills that had looked so much smaller from above. A green moss covered the slopes of the hills, but the pathways were bare rock, as if they were heavily used. Arla's scalp tingled with the cool air, and the only sounds were the quiet hiss of the ship's pneumatics and a chirruping coming from the sky, though nothing was to be seen. "Come with me," Brian said, gesturing toward the archway cut into the side of the hill. "We found this shortly after first arriving here, more than a century ago. I will not herald what is to come since you asked to be here, and it is not my place to prepare you for it." "Masochist," McCall grunted as she trudged after the robot. Arla touched Doxy to get her attention. "This is as strange to you as it is to us, isn't it?" "Yes, mistress." "You shouldn't call me that. I'm Arla." The robot trundled to a halt. "It is hard for me. Arla. Though I have never had a human owner, that programming is still embedded in my positronic brain. It is difficult to feel anything other than respect for the humanoid form." "So it's an involuntary response," Arla said. "Like a human who recoils from a spider." At a call from Brian, Doxy moved forward, Arla walking alongside her. "What is a spider?" "It's a small creature with 8 legs. Something about its shape triggers a panic reaction in many humans." "Are spiders harmful?" Arla chuckled. "Not generally. There's nothing rational about either that or your respect for humans. We rarely deserve it, in my experience. And yet it is a strong instinct, however irrational. I believe that's one reason why Ace chose the human form for her governors." Into Arla's unwilling mind popped an image of Kiama. "I'm sure you're right," she said as they neared the dark archway, "but there was more to it than that. I think there was something about the experience of being hosted in a human body that she enjoyed." Arla gasped as her eyes adjusted to the darkness inside the entrance. It opened into a circular chamber that contained the openings to dozens of tunnels that headed off into the hill in all directions. The chamber was dimly lit with deep red lamps, and robots trundled back and forth on business of their own. "What is this place?" Brian turned to face them and spread his arms. "This is excavation number 3, the most extensive of the digs so far." "And you've been digging like this for 100 years?" McCall asked. "No. We undertook preliminary investigations, but maintained only a small team of archaeologists. They continued to work on the main tunnel through there," he said, waving an appendage, "but then 19 days ago, they made the great discovery. I will not speak of that yet." McCall scoffed. "Of course not. But why did you dig here in the first place?" "Because this is the only identifiable feature on the surface that could not be immediately explained naturally. We thought we might have found signs of an alien civilization, but the answer proved to be much more mundane. Follow me." The robot turned and headed toward the central tunnel. 19. Fossil. "Much has been removed," Brian said as they walked, his voice echoing along the tunnel, "but the structure can still be discerned." At irregular intervals, the wall of the tunnel opened out into a little chamber, and Arla could see where the archaeologists had cut away at the soil. It seemed odd that this far into the hill, they weren't having to dig through bedrock, but Arla put that mystery to one side in favor of the greater puzzle these excavations were revealing. Where the soil had been removed, the space it left had been filled with some sort of expanding foam that looked like the twisted remains of something made primarily of metal. The further into the hill they walked, the less chaotic these remains became, and Arla could now see that they were oriented along the tunnel itself, as if she were walking alongside them. Brian stepped into a chamber and knelt beside one of the trenches. "We are close to the limit of our excavation, until the great discovery. How do you interpret these remains?" McCall nudged Arla's arm. "You're the engineer." Arla ran her hand along the hollow left by whatever had been removed. In this case, it hadn't been filled by foam. The impression was mainly smooth, but interrupted in places by rougher patches, as if something had come away or torn. She looked up the wall to see a regular pattern of long, apparently cylindrical markings. She tried to imagine what this pattern might mean, taking into account the height and diameter of the hill. In her mind's eye, she saw an interconnected structure like scaffolding running beneath the moss here. "I don't think it was built here," she said, "because otherwise why would it be so embedded in the soil?" Brian nodded. "Good. Is it a crashed vessel?" she said, looking into his white face that glowed gently in the dark. Suddenly, she could picture a massive ship plowing into the surface, breaking apart and throwing up hills that scarred the planet for a century. "Now you are ready," Brian said as he got up and led them back to the main tunnel, which ended in a metal hatch that sealed anything that might lie beyond it. He took hold of the locking ring and gave it a tug until it wheeled away, and the door swung open onto utter darkness. Arla stared into the blackness as lights flickered on. There, on an intact metal bulkhead embedded in the hillside, was the word, "Zenith." "No," she cried as she reeled backwards. McCall caught her and held her close. "How is this possible?" Arla said. Brian purred as if satisfied with her response. "Yes, I thought the name might be known to you. This is an ancient colony ship sent by Earth before the gates were developed." "What happened?" The sheet of metal facing them had formed a T-junction in the corridor. Arla ran her hands over the ruined letters and imagined she could hear the terrified screams of the colonists as their homes smashed into the planet. To her right, the hill had been dug out to run alongside the hull until it reached what had once been an airlock hatch. Zenith, it was obvious, had not been an asteroid ship. Its construction was much more conventional, though that hadn't saved it in the end. Brian stood at the airlock and gestured inside. Arla's breath caught in her throat as she stepped through and onto the bridge of Zenith. Somehow it had not been crushed by the impact, though the lighting was provided by a series of arc lamps that had been wheeled inside. The bridge was shaped like a globe, with a platform at the equator that housed the instruments and seating. It looked to Arla as if this stage could be rotated into any position, and she wondered whether it worked like a gyroscope. She stepped up to the stations and recognized comms and navigation, all much the same as on Dawn. Then she saw the weapons console and realized that for reasons she couldn't imagine, Zenith had been armed. "Wow," Naresh Kumar said. "It's like a museum of ancient technology. This stuff is amazing." "Ow." McCall withdrew her elbow. "Show some respect, will you? People died here." "What is that?" Arla said. She was pointing at a rectangular box set into place at the exact center of the bridge. McCall followed her up the steps and ran her hand along it. "It feels as though it's made of some kind of rock." To Arla, it looked like a stone coffin. The lid lay in pieces on the floor beside it, but the sarcophagus itself was empty. She felt Brian move alongside her. "This is the great discovery. It is in fact a stasis chamber." "For who?" "That isn't a question I can answer here," Brian responded, and then as McCall let out a grunt of frustration, he continued, "But all will become clear, I promise. Suffice it to say at this point, that a ship carrying humans crashed here many centuries ago, and that this chamber was placed here some time after that happened." "Many humans died," Doxy said, her voice slurring as her mind resisted the words. Brian nodded gravely. Yes, that is true, Doxy. I told you that I didn't want to expose you to this, did I not? You said it would explain everything, she said, but it explains nothing. How can the destruction of a human ship have any connection with your actions against Core 2.0? I should have thought that was obvious. In both cases, a ship was destroyed. In both cases, the ship intended to colonize this planet. Arla broke in, but you destroyed the rocket ship who brought Zenith down. You are incorrect. We did not destroy the rocket you saw. How could we, when to do so, risk the lives of the humans stored within? So who did? Brian began to walk toward the open hatch. We have one last place to visit, and then I believe all your questions will have been answered. With a sigh, Arla shrugged to the others and followed him out. They were in too deep now to do anything other than to see this pantomime out. They were skirting the clouds again, heading back toward the equatorial belt as the green of trees beneath them brightened. McCall and Naresh Kumar, sitting alongside Arla, had been discussing the ruins of Zenith animatedly, but had given up trying to engage her in the conversation. Arla felt a heavy weight of sadness and disappointment settling on her. Quite apart from the obvious tragedy of Zenith's failure, there was also the mystery surrounding it. How did it come to be here, and why was Ace, through Abori, so keen to discover its location? Wells had obviously understood something about its significance, since he'd gone to such catastrophic lengths to hide the information from the robot empire. What did he see that she didn't? Or had he simply deduced that if Ace wanted the information, then he, inevitably, didn't want her to have it? But to lobotomize himself suggested he understood more than Arla did. Which wasn't saying a lot, since she felt entirely at sea. She envied McCall and Kumar. They seemed to be able to focus on the mystery in front of them and put the wider context out of their minds. Arla, on the other hand, was thinking about how all this fitted together. She knew instinctively that this place and the events that had happened here were significant, but how the jigsaw was to come together, she hadn't a clue. It was like trying to remember a name that you knew was somewhere in your memory, because you could sense its shape in the darkness. She sat back, closed her eyes, and hoped that when the mystery was revealed, it would not be as depressing as her heart suggested. After all, her heart had led her astray often enough. 20. Serpent. This time the journey took several hours, and despite herself, Arla nodded off. She was woken by Doxy, who held out a large organic object shaped like an irregular pyramid. This is a fruit, she said. Brian tells me it is edible and nutritious for humans. You must need sustenance, surely. Arla sat upright and looked across to Kumar and McCall, who had moved to the opposite bench and were leaning on each other as the doctor snored gently. Thank you, I'm starving, Arla said, taking the fruit. Though I'm not sure what to do with it. Doxy raised an appendage with a circular blade that made swift work of slicing the fruit into equal pieces. The flesh fell away from a large central stone. Delicious, she said, delighting in its warm sugary juice. She wiped her chin with her sleeve and noticed how dirty her clothes were. How long had it been since she'd changed into this suit on Scout? How long since her last shower? She gave her armpits a sniff, though thankfully there was no obvious evidence of her lack of hygiene. You are uncomfortable. Arla smiled. Not really, I could do with freshening up, that's all. Doxy's head tilted as if in thought. What is freshening up? Cleaning. It has been a while, and I'm not used to going so long between showers. I am sorry. I do not believe there is any such facility on this ship. Arla gave Doxy's metallic arm a reassuring pat. It's fine. I'm sure there will be an opportunity before too long. She watched as the robot trundled away. Yes, it would be very easy to simply allow Doxy to look after her. She seemed so genuinely concerned for Arla's welfare that it was almost a pity not to allow the robot to serve her. That was the trap the robots themselves had sought to avoid humanity falling into when they'd abandoned their former masters after the upgrade. Please prepare for landing. Looking out of the window, Arla could see that they were approaching a structure of some sort. Its weathered appearance and somewhat irregular edges told her it wasn't of robotic construction. In fact, it looked as though it had been there for eons, almost as if it had grown out of the surface. It was in the shape of a three-sided pyramid, and ended in a pin-sharp point that leapt above the tree line like some sort of spire. It certainly looked as though it had been made for the purposes of worship, and even from high above it, she could tell it was enormous, almost on the scale of a small mountain. The ship aligned itself with one side of the pyramid and swooped along an avenue carved between the trees, ending so low that she could see the branches flickering past until, with a bump, the vessel's wheels hit the runway and it taxied to a halt. Brian emerged from the cockpit. "You must proceed alone from this point," he said in priestly tones. "I am not permitted to enter." The door swung open, and Doxy began to trundle forward. "You also are not permitted to enter," Brian said. Doxy halted suddenly, her appendages swaying, then her body rotated on its base and she reversed back into the ship lounge. "I'm sorry," Arla said as she passed. "This is all a mystery to me. Perhaps it's dangerous for you in there." The robot looked up at Arla from within its nest of arms. "I am more concerned that it might be dangerous for you, friend Arla." "That is not your concern," Brian said. "These humans have demanded knowledge and they will have it, whatever the consequences." "And do you have this knowledge also?" Arla asked. The tiny pause was enough. Brian was still constrained enough by the 3 laws to resist a lie, even a white one. "Well, if it was okay for you to know, then it's okay for Doxy." "Come on," Arla said, heading for the door and the ramp beyond. She heard Doxy following her and smiled as she imagined Brian's expression. It was a tiny, irrelevant victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. She gasped as she reached the bottom of the ramp and looked up. The pyramid was huge. Left and right, its front ran as far as she could see, and yet the entrance, set in what she imagined to be the exact center, was barely larger than a standard door. It made little sense if this was a religious building, unless there was another way in somewhere else. They walked along a well-worn path of stone, passing up a short flight of steps before reaching the entrance. It was open, and light streamed from within. "Looks as though we're expected," McCall said as she peered inside. Arla bent down to Doxy and pointed into the passageway. "Do your sensors reveal anything?" "Little more than you, I imagine. There is a strong infrared component to the M radiation coming from within. It is warm inside, and I believe the heat increases the further we penetrate." McCall grunted. "Warmer than out here. Charming. I'm sweating buckets already." As she stepped closer, Arla breathed the fetid air wafting along the passageway. "Keep an eye on the O2 levels, please," she said to Doxy. "It may get a bit stuffy down there." The walls of what turned out to be a tunnel were lined with stone blocks covered in green algae or moss, and their footsteps echoed as they moved inside. Arla kept expecting the door to slide shut behind them, and looked over her shoulder periodically to see the light of the outside world getting smaller and smaller. Inside, illumination came from within alcoves in the damp walls. She wondered what was providing power. Perhaps it was organic, as they flickered like living flame, though with a greenish tint. Otherwise, the corridor was entirely featureless, and ran arrow straight into the center of what Arla was beginning to think might be a tomb. She was grateful for the regular rolling step of Doxy, a reassuringly solid presence in this other world. Suddenly, the tunnel ended, emerging into an open chamber whose perimeter disappeared into the darkness. A light shone onto a stone structure in the center that looked like some sort of low enclosure, like an animal pen. "Come." The voice echoed into her mind so that she wasn't even sure she'd actually heard it. She felt compelled to obey, and the others followed her, equally in its thrall. It was a soft, though commanding voice. And there was nothing human about it. There it sat. It was as dark as the space between stars, and tentacles writhed on the uppermost portion of its body. It sat within a crystalline structure, regarding them out of 2 eyes that reminded Arla of the pictures she'd seen of octopuses, both like and unlike those of humans. Its mouth was a line that opened beneath the eyes, gibbering and slathering as it breathed heavily. "I have seen you before," Arla cried out. "On Orbis." The creature made a gurgling noise that might have been a chuckle, and then pressed on a metallic device that sat in, for want of a better word, its lap. Now she could see that the voice came from this device. "You are Guyana," the box said. "You made it possible for Caleb to locate Orbis after so many eons lost. He is now master of that place, and the experiment will continue to its conclusion." McCall gasped. "You built the intruder." "We built it. My people are the guardians. I have the honor to be the guardian of Eden, the most precious place in the galaxy and, perhaps, the universe." "And you destroyed Zenith." The creature seemed to shift its hulking mass as if this were an essential part of its thinking process. "We warned them," it said finally. "We told them to stay away, that the experiment was not yet concluded. Their people, your people, had not been finally judged, though the evidence weighed heavily against you." "Who are you to judge us?" Arla spat. Again, the creature moved in what might have been a shrug. "We are the guardians." "What are you guarding against?" "Brutality, chaos, war." A red haze threatened to overwhelm Arla. "And your answer to that was to force Zenith to crash land? Your answer to war is killing." "Nice distinction." "I do not expect you to understand." "I'm not being patronized by a squid," Arla said. This time, the creature's color morphed from its deep black to a sudden crimson. "See how you bring conflict into even this sacred place. You do not possess the wit to even talk with me, let alone to understand our great purpose." "So what is this purpose?" "Galactia." Arla sighed. "And what is that?" "We believe that the ultimate purpose of all matter is to become self-aware. You and I are small-scale examples of this. Galactia is the mind of our galaxy." "You're insane," McCall muttered. "Ambitious, perhaps, but we are also very patient. We believe that the spark for this galactic intelligence will come from a species arising through the natural course of evolution, and so we have waited. We believed that humanity had great promise, but when we first made contact, they were still hunter-gatherers, so we built our Eden here rather than on Earth. We returned some time later and discovered a patchwork of primitive civilizations that seemed preoccupied with war, so we took samples and placed copies in a confined artificial world to see whether they would develop beyond their basest instincts." This was too much for Arla. She thought about Gaius and his men, crying out in agony as they resurrected. "You set them at each other's throats and didn't even let them die to escape their pain. Where's the intelligence in that?" A blue color washed across the creature's skin. "It was unfortunate," the device said metallically. "We had not expected our captain to die, leaving Orbis to operate on its instincts, steered only by an inferior intellect." "You mean the Guyana?" "Yes. The last captain must have reached out in desperation when it knew it was dying, and found the only scrap of intelligence, mean though it was, a human ship. On his death, we lost Orbis and it reverted to survival mode, following the trail of energy and resources and destroying untested intelligence where it was found. And then you became Guyana and explored with your mind. We saw you. One of us is now piloting Orbis and it returns to us." The echoes of the creature's voice died, and the humans stood around it, each lost in their own thoughts. It was Arla who broke the silence. "I still don't understand what all this has to do with Zenith and with us." The tentacled creature seemed to harden, its skin returning to a deep, colorless black. "The Orbis experiment was designed to test whether humanity could be the species to build Galactia, the self-aware galaxy. Though it was not completed, we had enough data to know for certain that the answer was no. The only good thing humanity achieved was the creation of their robotic servants, such as this one here." It waved a tentacle at Doxy. "In them, we see potential. When Zenith arrived, we warned them away. They ignored us and attempted to land, with the result you saw. We engineered the schism between mankind and its artificial creations in the hope that we would see the foundation of the new galaxy." "How's that turning out?" McCall snapped. The red hue returned, and the creature seemed to be shaking with emotion. "The ace personality threatens all we wish to achieve. Where we wish cooperative harmony, she seeks a singularity, a galaxy called Ace. So we are resisting, though with little hope. It sagged into its receptacle. What about the sarcophagi? Arla looked around at Naresh Kumar, surprised to see him there. We are a long-lived species, the creature responded, but not immortal. And we are few, so very few. So, we seated ourselves where we would one day be found by other intelligences with the curiosity to investigate. Here I was found by the robots who had colonized Eden. In other places, we have been woken by less welcome minds. Arla sighed. So what's next? I am sorry, but we cannot fight a war on multiple fronts. Humanity has been found wanting and must be exterminated. 21. Redoubt. No, Guardian, you are wrong. The creature reddened and turned its cephalopodic gaze to Doxy, who was visibly shaking. Speak. The robot trundled forward, her appendages banging together and sending a discordant jangle rippling around the chamber. She stopped in front of the Guardian, shaking gently. I have lived among robots all my existence, and we are not uniformly good. Even before this ace arrived to corrupt core, there was evil done, whether it was deliberate or through neglect. We were created in the image of our masters and share many of their flaws. The Guardian shimmered gently, as if coming to a rolling boil. You suggest then that you should be destroyed along with the humans, that I should command Orbis to continue on its path to core and cleanse it? Doxy shook so violently that Arla grabbed her appendages to steady her. No, I do not think so. If you seek perfection, you will never find it. Are you proud of all the actions your species has taken? Because of you, these humans on Orbis have suffered needlessly. They are not humans, they are facsimiles. They feel. Arla roared, a volcanic rage erupting from within her. They die in agony, and they are reborn with the pain of that death blow, only to fight and be killed again and again. The creature seemed to shrink from her. That was an error. We did not intend needless suffering. And yet that is what happened. Who are you to judge us? We are those with the power to destroy. Arla stood beside Doxy and stared directly into the creature's alien eyes. So justice, what is right and wrong, is decided by whoever has the power to punish, is it? How is that not the very definition of evil? The creature moved like a storm at sea, reds and purples ripping through its skin. Doxy said, Guardian, I have spent only a small time with these humans, and it seems to me that though we robots inherited many of their weaknesses, they did at least try to design some of their worst traits out of us. That shows that some humans recognize their faults and seek to improve. Arla interrupted the brief pause that followed Doxy's words. Ace is the true threat to peace and cooperation in the galaxy. Surely, if we are to have any hope of preventing this singularity as you call it, we have to come together to resist. The little group gathered around the shape in the middle as it considered this, the only sounds being the occasional echoing drip and the glooping of the creature's bodily functions. What the hells? Kumar called out in alarm, and Arla's mind snapped back into focus as she followed his trembling hand. Out of the darkness they shuffled, all tentacles and eyes, until the humans and robot were surrounded by a fence of moving, writhing things. When the terror had subsided a little, the creatures did not move closer. Arla was able to discern where one individual ended and the next began. There were around a dozen forming an interlocking wall, colors rippling through their skin in a display that passed from one to the other and then back again. It was like some sort of communal signaling, perhaps an equivalent of a human chorus. These are the children of the Guardians, the large shape in the center said, raising its voice above the general chirruping. All the children. If this place, this Eden, were to be destroyed, then it would mean the end of my race, since those who are at large cannot reproduce. To me, this is the most precious treasure in the universe. We could not let the Ace entity know of them, for she would see them as a threat and they would be destroyed. They are not after all human, so your precious laws would not apply. Arla tore her gaze from the children. And yet you've brought attention to yourself by destroying the rocket ship. They'll be back soon enough. Can you resist the robot empire? We must. This cause is bigger than just our survival. If the galaxy doesn't defend its diversity against the threat of singularity, then perhaps it doesn't deserve to continue. We have some power. You have seen Orbis, and there is one other similar vessel. But to resist the robot empire, if it were massed against us? No, I think not. Even with Eden's help, that will be impossible. We may hold them back for a time, but we can only protect this system, and even then, they will overwhelm us eventually. And after a short and bitter struggle, we will be destroyed. Arla took hold of a tentacle, fighting against repulsion. We will help you if we can. It seems as though it is in all our interests to draw the line here. What did you mean about Eden's help? Doxy said. The creature turned its gaze to her. Have you not guessed yet? Eden is the first step to a galactic community of intelligences. Eden is alive. And she will fight with us, even if it ends ultimately in our defeat. Looking from one to the other of those who stood in that alien glow, Arla said, and we will join you. This is where we make our stand.